May 17th, 1885. The agency at Turkey Creek woke to a still morning and to quiet talk that never stopped in the adobe rows. Geronimo had sat for hours through the night with Nietzsche, Yanoja, and Ulzana, weighing what the Indian police would do next and what General George Crook would allow. The San Carlos ration line had felt like a noose for months, with flour measured in tight scoops and beef issued on a schedule that did not match hunger. The men had watched arrests elsewhere and heard of men marched into guardhouses and held without choices. The talk that night settled on one decision. They would ride. Turkey Creek lay in the pines and juniper north of the Salt River country, a sub-agency scattered along a bend where wagons could turn and where the agency carpenter had stacked planks for a new shed. White smoke from cook fires hung low at dawn. The agency herd was still within reach, horses drowsing with hobbles in the grass. In the small hours, Nietzsche moved among the wickiups and brush shelters, tapping shoulders and whispering names. Women rolled blankets tight, dropped them into rawhide slings and tied them behind saddles. Children were lifted onto ponies that had been kept close for weeks for this moment. Geronimo, who had watched each face without blinking, checked the cartridge belts that had been hidden beneath baskets and under sleeping pallets. Repeating rifles lay wrapped in blankets so that their steel would not reflect first light. The break with the reservation routine had not come out of nothing. Months of confinement had eroded trust. Work details at San Carlos and Turkey Creek had taken men away from hunting grounds. Whiskey sellers had prowled the edges, feeding quarrels, then the agents' men had cracked down and used those quarrels as cause. Stories had come north of Chiricahua, sent east in irons in earlier years, and of punishments that did not end. When a policeman laid a hand on a man's shoulder and said, "Come," that hand could mean a cell in a rail car. Geronimo had gone in before and come out, and he knew the difference between promises given in the shade of a cottonwood and orders written in a fort office. He trusted the words he could hear from his own kin and the path he could see with his own eyes. At first light, the men cut the hobbles on the best horses and brought them up without shouting. Ulzana moved with a short rope and a quiet hand, swapping out tired mounts for animals with more wind. Yanoja checked the line of pack animals and measured each load. The women had already wrapped dried beef, ground corn, and rolled strips of mescal fiber. A girl lifted a small pot and tied it to a saddle frame with a thong. Boys passed canteens with stoppers cut from wood. A small child woke and started to cry, and his mother cupped a hand over his mouth and spoke his name, then rocked him as she walked. The sun pushed a pale arc over the ridges. There was no ceremony, there was movement. They did not ride down the obvious road toward the San Carlos flats. They angled into the timber and used the ground that gave them cover, sliding into long fingers of shadow that still held night. The first miles rolled beneath the horses at a steady walk, not a run, because a long run at the start breaks more than it gains. Nietzsche set the pace. Men rode outward to watch the flanks. Others circled back to scuff prints and drag a branch over the worst of the sign. The brush at creek crossings was bent just enough to pass a body through, then lifted back with care. Where a slope turned to loose stone, they stepped wide to let hooves strike rock and leave fewer marks. The older women pointed at plants they could gather in motion, breaking seed heads and crushing green leaves in the hand for taste. Small bundles of baby clothes and cooking tools hung off both sides of patient mules that had been trained to follow a lead rope without balking. Behind them, the agency stirred late, then fully. A clerk noticed empty stalls and a missing stack of blankets. Two Indian policemen compared notes and realized that men they were to question had vanished. When the first runner hit the telegraph key, the line clicked through Fort Apache and beyond. The message was plain. Geronimo had gone. Nietzsche had gone. Several families and a count of armed men had gone. The names moved by wire faster than any horse could run. Within hours, sergeants at small posts opened the stable doors and threw saddles onto tired animals because there was no time to be choosy. Civilians along the stage roads heard the news by noon, and the ones who knew the names kept their families close and their doors barred. Geronimo kept the column tight through the day and stopped well before dark to let the women tend to the children and to water the horses in a narrow draw where sound would not carry far. Men posted on the ridgeline watched the empty country. The smell of smoke was kept close to the ground. Nietzsche ate quickly, then walked the line to check the packs for a second time. A boy asked if they were going to the mountains where water runs cold over stone, and a woman told him that they would go where the men said, and that he would drink when the horses drank. Far to the north, a patrol of Indian police found a line of scuffed earth and a scrap of cloth snagged on a low branch. They followed until the light failed and then backed out to keep from being swallowed by ground they did not know well. The riders angled southeast to rougher country and set a path that led toward the border and the Sierra Madre. They did not talk about the name that soldiers used for that end of the land, a word that meant mother range, or about the patrol patterns from Fort Bowie or Fort Huachuca. They talked about water. They named seeps and springs in a low voice, measuring days by known places where a man could press his face to the earth and drink. They passed through a stand of tall grass that rattled against stirrup leathers. They climbed to a bench where the breeze cut heat off their backs. They dropped into a wash where a man could smell damp earth beneath dry sand. A woman loosened a strap, lifted a child down, and let him walk a few steps to settle his legs. The band did not string out because distance between mounts invites knives in the dark. By the second day, the trail showed a steadier rhythm. Scouts ranged in pairs. Tracks of deer crossed their own. Near midday, a rider cut sign that was too sharp to be anything but men moving fast behind them, horses at a trot, iron shoes crisp in the dust. The group adjusted without a word. Loads were shifted to fewer animals. Some blankets were left behind, cut loose and shoved into brush to keep the trail clear. Geronimo's face did not change. He told Nietzsche to send a small party down a side draw to lay false sign. He told Olzana to pick 3 men and move across a ridge to watch the back trail. When the sun fell and the first cold settled into the low ground, a boy shivered and his mother pulled him inside her blanket and held him close. The men listening to the night could hear coyotes call and an owl talk from a stand of oak. The pursuing soldiers pushed hard from Fort Apache, then from other posts as orders spread, and they were joined by Apache scouts who knew the country and could read a hoof scuff like a letter. The scouts moved straight and fast, heads tilted to judge weight in a print and to note the small crumble that means recent passage. The soldiers who followed felt the pull in the legs that comes from riding long at the edge of a canter, and they tasted alkali dust at the back of the throat. Their carbines rode in scabbards that rattled against stirrup irons. A corporal counted canteens and found one low. The lieutenant ordered a cut across country that trimmed a mile at the cost of 2 horses going lame on stone. The telegraph moved new instructions between forts, and wagons rolled to set supply dumps where patrols could re-water and pick up grain. In the camp that night, Geronimo's people chewed meat in small bites and let the youngest sleep. A woman mended a strap by firelight, pushing a bone awl through stiff leather with steady hands. Nietzsche spoke quietly to 2 men about a crossing ahead where they would need to move in silence. A boy asked his uncle why they did not stop and build a big fire and sing. His uncle told him that the old songs would be sung again when men did not listen for pursuers who carried chains in their saddlebags. Ulzana sat with his back to a boulder and pulled cartridges from a small sack, running his thumb over each one to feel for a crushed rim or a dent that could fail at a bad time. They crossed into broken country that gave them cover and choices. Canyons cut deep and crooked. Arroyos bent away from the line a man might think to take. Rock ledges gave high points for a watcher to see dust and to listen for the wrong kind of clatter. The women moved steadily and kept the children close. Packs were shifted again to favor animals with better wind. When a mule balked at a narrow turn, two men stepped in without noise, lifted the tail and pushed until the animal committed to the angle and went through. They climbed toward higher ground that pointed the way south. Men who had been born on these trails nodded to each other at small signs, a stain on stone from old seep water, a stand of oak that meant deeper soil and a chance at moisture below. A day later, the band skirted a ranch that lay too close to their path to ignore. Two men rode in under cover of brush and cut loose a handful of horses, then pushed them out toward the flats. A woman watched from the ridge with a child at her hip. The rider who had cut sign earlier pointed to a thin line of dust on the northern horizon. They did not stop to count the riders under that dust. They pressed on. From the ranch, a man with a rifle fired 2 shots into open ground after the fleeing figures, not expecting to hit anything, only to shout a warning toward neighbors who might hear gunfire and who would know what it meant. Through the next days, the pattern hardened. The group carried the old and the very young. They made miles at night when the moon gave light and when the horses could step without snapping a leg. They picked paths that crossed hard ground, then doubled back through scrub that caught at rawhide and wrists. When a child woke from a nightmare, the women muffled the sound with blankets and quiet words. Men left small traps of sign to lead pursuers into dead ground, a line of prints that vanished into rock then reappeared far off in a wash, a single scuffed heel set in the wrong direction to slow a tracker for a minute or two. Word of killing spread on both sides of the line in the weeks that followed the breakout. Small ranches counted dead and buried them in hard soil. Couriers rode with notes folded into oilcloth, carrying descriptions that were short and plain: man, woman, boy, girl, horse, rifle. Some of the fleeing men lashed out to seize food and to keep the chase off balance, moving fast and hitting where watch was thin. In the towns, doors were barred at dusk and lamps were turned down. Patrols rode out from forts and from settlements, always a step behind a band that knew how to slide off a ridge without showing a silhouette against the sky. The army shifted from a single pursuit to lines that tried to fence off routes to water and to the border. Scouts marked seeps that could not be left open, then stationed small parties to watch them. Messengers went out to draw in more companies. Crook measured what he had and knew that numbers alone did not decide this kind of chase. He leaned on Apache scouts for knowledge and on supply lines to keep patrols from starving their mounts. The men in the saddle carried Springfield carbines and Colt revolvers and sometimes old Henrys that had found their way into army hands, while the men they chased carried a mix of Winchesters, captured government pieces, and a few weapons bought or traded in border towns. The men in uniform wore issue boots that tore at the heel on steep slopes, while the men in flight moved in moccasins that felt the ground and left prints that a man could hide in a line of hoof marks. Geronimo's band crossed into the harsh folds that lead toward the Mexican side, where the country breaks into longer ridges and deeper cuts. The horses showed sweat marks that dried white with salt. The women cut strips of mezcal and chewed them for strength. Children were carried when the ground turned mean. Nietzsche walked sections on foot to spare his mount for the next hard run. Yanoja climbed a knob and scanned with his hand flat over his eyes. He called out a low warning when he saw dust far off that did not belong to wind. The group bent its path through tamarisk and thorn, looking for the kind of gravel that takes footprints poorly. On a narrow shelf above a dry watercourse, the band stopped to breathe. Men checked girths and rubbed at withers. Women refilled canteens by scraping damp sand and letting water seep into a cup, then tipping it into leather flasks. A small boy pointed at a hawk that rode a thermal above the ridgeline. Geronimo stood with his hands at his sides and looked south. He knew where he needed to go. He knew that the first hard step had been made and that the next steps would be harder still. He told Nietzsche to hold the line together through the next stretch where the trail cut too close to a known patrol route. He told Ulzana to send a pair down a side wash to check for fresh sign of men on foot. When the first Mexican outpost caught wind of movement, messages traveled along the border from ranch to town and from town to garrison. The land that lay ahead was no safer, but it was better known to the men who now led the band, and the waterholes there had names they had said in childhood. The path to the Sierra Madre would not erase the chase, it would sharpen it. The families who had been lifted into saddles at Turkey Creek and who had crossed into the rough country now felt the weight of a long pursuit that had only begun. The break from the agency was a line that could not be uncrossed. The first weeks after the flight carved a pattern into every day. The morning started in silence, with loads tied down and a quick swallow of cold food. The midday passed without a fire, with the sun burning skin and drying lips, with horses that needed rest they could not be given. The evening came with small flames hidden in cuts and with meat warmed for the youngest. Mothers told children plain truths in low voices. Fathers and uncles walked a little way off the camp edge to read the ground and to look for the shape of men in the dark. When fear rose, the band answered with movement, because to hold still invites hands to close. Behind them, the department headquarters set new orders and sent them by wire, and officers on the line issued more to patrol leaders by voice at dawn. The scouts who knew the ground best were given the most dangerous tasks. They took them because they were paid and because their own families were at stake. A scout knelt to study a print where a heel had slipped a little on a slope, and he measured the stride to guess whether the man who made it had been tired. Another scout cut across a ridge to check a water hole that the band might try for that night. The cavalryman cursed at cactus thorns and smiled without humor at horses that pulled at the bit when the trail turned downhill. On a day when heat sat heavy and the air did not move, the band crossed a gap where a wrong step meant a fall. A woman led a horse by the cheek strap and spoke to it as if to a child. A boy walked behind her and planted each foot where she had planted hers. Men stood above and watched the line pass. Geronimo crossed last, turned and scanned the back trail. He nodded once to Nietzsche, then stepped away from the edge and urged the column along the shelf that fed into a safer cut. The smell of crushed sage rose in the heat and faded. They reached a basin with a stand of cottonwoods that meant water near enough to pull with a digging stick. The band rested there as long as they dared. A man leaned his forehead against a horse's neck and listened to the animal breathe. A woman combed burrs from her child's hair with careful fingers and dropped the burrs into a small fire to burn them so they would not catch in someone else's feet later. Ulzana returned from a scout with dust on his boots and said the trail behind was empty for the moment, but he did not trust quiet for long. Nietzsche sent a pair to the rim to watch while he and Janoja checked the loads once more, tightening rawhide and shifting weight to keep the animals from souring. They moved again as the sun bent low, because evening hides sign and because it is safer to make miles under a sky that is no longer white with glare. The line stretched a little, then pulled tight at each pinch point. The riders near the back turned in their saddles to watch for dust. The riders near the front looked for the next good cut. Children fell asleep against their mothers. Men rolled shoulders and eased cramped thighs. The sound of iron on stone clicked at odd intervals, a reminder that one bad step can crack a hoof and lose a horse for good. By the time the band slid across the line that men had drawn on a map, they had made a clean cut from Turkey Creek and from the agency food and from the schedule of men who kept books and counted heads. They had chosen a path that required them to live on knowledge earned in hard ground and to trust only the people in their circle. The chase behind them had grown from a handful of policemen to soldiers and scouts and civilian posses, and it would grow again. The men and women at the heart of the flight did not count the numbers. They counted the miles to the Sierra Madre and the water, holes that had to be reached without missing one. What lay ahead would test every such count. The men who had carried repeating rifles wrapped against the light would face soldiers who now carried orders to keep pressure on without relief. The rough land would give cover and would take strength. The old ones would be carried when the path turned steep. The young ones would learn to keep silent when a pebble slipped underfoot. The choice made at dawn at Turkey Creek held, and it would define every step that followed. January 10th, 1886. The light came pale and cold over the Jaros River country in northern Sonora, the kind of winter morning when breath hangs and every sound carries through rock. Captain Emmett Crawford had made his Apache scouts move through the last dark mile on silent feet, packs tight and cinches checked by touch rather than sight. They had trailed Geronimo's people for days, reading scuffs where moccasins slipped on frost, counting ash flecks where coals had been buried, and measuring how many animals had watered from a seep by the depth of the prints in the mud. The trail had angled along the bends of the Jaros, then turned toward a cluster of brush shelters and low fires tucked under a shoulder of stone. There, at first clear light, the scouts went in. The strike was quick, planned to leave no time for a mounted dash. Men crawled in among rocks while others ghosted forward under the willow fringe. A dog barked once and was silenced by a low hiss and a hand on its muzzle. A woman's pot cracked in the coals when a boot heel brushed it over. The first shots were few and close. A man trying to swing into a saddle fell with his foot half in the stirrup and his shoulder in the dust. 2 ponies bolted and were caught by rawhide hackamores and turned. Children were pulled toward the stream bed and shielded by the bodies of women who moved with their heads down and their eyes cold. When the echoes died, the camp lay open, fires kicked out, blankets scattered, grain bags slashed so that corn spilled and rolled like small yellow beads into the sand. Crawford ordered the work done without noise. He had 81 scouts on the line, and only a handful of white officers and civilians. He told the scouts what to take and what to burn. Horses and mules were led out and tied to a brush line. Rifles, ammunition, and blankets were gathered in heaps and counted twice, because in this ground a miscount could mean a man ran dry in a fight a day later. Packs of dried meat and venison were set aside. What could not be carried was destroyed. A boy stood with tears drying on both cheeks, watching his mother pull a small bundle of clothes tight and tie it to what she could save. An old man who had been slow to wake sat with his hands slack at his sides and stared at the place where his fire had been. The scouts moved around him with the same flat efficiency they applied to ruins and loads, taking what the command would need to live. One of the surviving women came under escort to talk. She said in a steady voice that Geronimo had gone out of the camp before dawn to watch sign and to choose the next water. She said he sent word that he would talk in the morning. Crawford had run this long, hungry chase with the understanding that talk could come at the end of a hard blow. And he knew that the only thing more dangerous than a desperate man was a desperate man at the end of his food. He agreed to meet, set a place in his head, and ordered the command to camp a short distance above the captured ground. The scouts ate a little meat and chewed it down to fibers because their own packs had been behind them and the pack train had lost time in the rough country. Every man checked his cartridges, tugged his blankets tight around his shoulders, and found a place in the rocks where he could lie down and still see the approach to camp. The night was cold enough to bite through canvas. Men kept fires small and low, feeding only dry wood and shielding flames with their bodies. A few of the younger scouts had gone out to look at the enemy's ruined camp again, the way fighters look at a battlefield after a victory to fix the shape of it in the mind. They came back with word that the ground was empty and that the families who had escaped had left everything that slowed them. A messenger was sent for the pack mules with orders to push them forward because the command had been moving hard without proper rations, and men walking on empty bellies think too much about the next stream bed instead of the next ridge. The officers lay with their boots on and their hats pulled low, hands close to weapons, and eyes half closed against the sting of smoke. At first good light on January 11th, the alarm went up from the outer rocks. The scouts shouted that soldiers were coming from the north. Crawford lay up on an elbow, listening hard with a veteran's ear, trying to tell by the ring of metal and the cadence of feet whether the men closing in were friendly or not. Lieutenant Marion Mouse and Second Lieutenant William Shipp ran forward with the chief of scouts and the interpreter to talk. Every order was to hold fire and make contact. The scouts called out the words for American soldiers. Men rose with empty hands raised to show they carried no immediate threat. The answer came as a volley. The first blasts hit from short range and cut dirt and rock around the sleeping ground. A scout who had not yet reached for his rifle cried out with a wound that knocked him flat where he lay. Chaos found form in trained habit. The scouts fell back into the rocks and spread along the rim to take cover, and a few answered with controlled shots to keep men from rushing the camp. Mouse and Shipp shouted in Spanish and in English that the camp was a United States command, that they were not hostiles, that officers stood in plain sight. Tom Horn, the civilian chief of scouts, called to men who held the high ground on the other side to stop. The firing checked for a moment. Crawford stood up on a low rock to show himself, a compact figure with beard, brown campaign hat, and an officer's uniform that stood out in that country of buckskins, cotton, and serapes. He made the universal open-handed gesture that says, "Do not fire," then pointed at the men around him and said the words for American soldiers so there could be no mistake. A single shot cracked from close in, and then a volley smashed the moment. Crawford fell back behind, the rock with a head wound that dropped him limp. Horn felt a strike in his arm. Scouts moved on their bellies to drag the captain into better cover, one of them working with the calm of a man who has seen more fights than he can count. The Mexicans who had opened the attack pushed for a better position, but the ground was full of broken stone and the scouts knew every angle of it. More Mexican soldiers tried to slide around to a higher knoll, but scouts got there first, hugging rock and waiting for the angle that gave a clear field of fire without exposing heads above the skyline. It was not a full battle line. It was a spitting match of rock to rock with the space between full of flecks of chipped stone and puffs of dust where bullets struck. The men in the United States camp kept calling out between shots. Mouse and Horn, both exposed more than was sensible, shouted again that they were Americans, that they had struck Geronimo's camp the day before, that the animals in their rope line had been captured and could be counted and checked to the brand. The scouts who had fired at first did it only to keep from being overrun. Now orders pulled their muzzles down again. On the other side, the attackers still fired from a hill not more than a few hundred yards away, either unable to hear the words in the noise or unwilling to accept them. The fight lasted in bursts, with rounds echoing back and forth, then a drop to silence, then another push and answer. 4 Mexican soldiers lay dead within view by the time the shooting slacked and men began to shout words that were meant to stop blood. Only then did a talk take shape. Horn went forward unarmed. Mouse followed. The officer with the Mexican force said they had made a mistake, that in the early light and the mist off the river they had taken the cluster of heads in the rocks for hostile Apaches, that they were hungry and in a bad way, that they needed to get back to their base and wished to carry their dead away. Mouse told them that the camp they had attacked was an American unit of Apache scouts and United States officers that had fought the hostiles the previous day, and had the captured stock to prove it. He pointed to where the hostiles had gone, over the river and out of reach. The Mexicans insisted on a paper that said the Americans fired, and Mouse agreed to a statement that put on the record that shots had been exchanged. The Mexican officer gave a piece of paper in return that said his men had fired without knowing who they faced. The talk was stiff, brittle with pride and with the knowledge that the fight had killed a United States officer. While words were traded, scouts made litters. Men cut canes into lengths and bundled them in fives with rawhide thongs to make frames strong enough to carry the wounded across ridges and arroyos. The pack train had still not come up, and the command was low on rations after days of lean travel. Ammunition had run down to a single belt per man and had been drawn down again by the 2 fights in 2 mornings. Men chewed a small ration of captured meat and let it sit in the mouth until saliva made it swallowable. Others held canteens like a promise and took only short drinks because water in that ground is a thing to be hoarded. Crawford did not speak. The wound in his head had taken him from the world of words. He breathed, but he did not know the men who leaned over him. The surgeon cleaned and dressed what he could in the field, hands cramped from work done without enough water, and with bandages that had to be cut from shirts and torn from sacks. Scouts watched the rim and whispered updates about dust columns and tracks beyond the river where the hostiles had stood and watched the exchange that morning. The Mexicans asked for medical help for their wounded, and after the United States men had tended their own, the doctor crossed under a flag of truce and did what could be done for the men who a short time before had been firing into the camp. By afternoon, the Mexicans had carried away their dead, the hostiles had slipped farther into the folds of the land, and the command had to move. There was no food to spare for anyone else. There was no extra ammunition to replace what had been fired or lost. The pack train was somewhere on the line, reportedly south of Nakuri, and the only way to get men and wounded to it was to pick up and push. Crawford was secured on a litter. Men took turns under the weight. The path from the Jaros country to the north crossed ugly ground, with rock shelves that tilt and grab at feet and with gullies that twist the ankles of tired men. Scouts moved ahead to check cuts and to watch for men who might wait with rifles. The officers spoke in low voices to keep the line together and to mark rest points, because the men under the poles needed rhythm and pace more than they needed speeches. As the litter moved, the cost of the morning's mistake settled into bone. Every man in the command had thought of what would follow the seizure of Geronimo's camp, that a talk might bring the band in and end a chase that had burned across months and hundreds of miles. Now they carried a captain with a wound that no surgeon could reverse. The men who had fired by mistake held papers that used the word error. But in the rocks where the first shot had rung, there had been close range and clear targets and officers in plain uniform. That would have to be argued out by men far from the rim of the Jaros. For the scouts and the officers on the ground, the job had narrowed to survival and to getting the wounded north. The next day, the command met a messenger who said that a woman from the hostile band had come in with a statement that men were ready to talk. Mouse listened with the face of a man who knows that such words can either open a door or spring a trap. He agreed to a meeting at a point measured by hills and a cut bank on a river, and he wrote the details tight so there would be no chance of confusion. He still held the litters and the wounded, and he had to measure talk against the duty to keep his men alive. Scouts were sent to mark the path and to watch the approaches. The line moved a little faster where the ground allowed for it, men changing out under the poles with a grunt and a nod. 2 days after the fight, the shattered column reached a place where talk could happen without someone on a ridge shooting down into it. There the word came that some families would come in, that the leaders held back and would meet again later. The men who heard that message had dust to their knees and salt on their collars. They knew what it cost to carry a wounded officer through country like this. Some of them believed that the fight that had taken their captain's mind had also taken away the chance to close this hunt quickly. Others looked ahead to the next talk and the next ridge and held their thoughts shut, because judgment is a luxury when men are on the move. On January 18th, after days of carrying him north toward better care and toward the line where supply might finally meet the command, Captain Emmett Crawford died. The place of death was near Nacori Chico, a small settlement lost in the folds of the Sierra Madre where men count their lives by the turns of the seasons and the weight of the harvest. He was buried there first, in the earth of the country where the last morning's mistake had opened on him at close range, before his remains were later taken home by comrades who would not leave him on foreign ground. The scouts who had carried him set down the poles and stood with their hands open, heads bare, faces empty of words. News of the killing moved through the border country and up the chain of command with a speed that had nothing to do with horses. Officers wrote statements that used plain dates and named the river and the hour when the shooting started. The men on the Mexican side sent papers that called the attack a misunderstanding in the gray light, and that asked that their wounded be treated and their dead be allowed to be carried away. Men in distant offices argued about treaties, the right to cross the line in pursuit, and whether Indian scouts should be allowed to enter another nation's ground under United States officers. On the ridges and in the canyons, men tightened cinches and kept riding because the band they had chased had not ceased moving. The work of pursuit did not stop for morning. Scouts who had slept beside Crawford's campfires went back out to read ground and to lead columns across stone, because the band that had been hit on the 10th had lost stock and blankets and food, and hungry fighters cut wider circles and take more chances. The men who had been within the rocks when the captain fell knew that the line between surrender and escape had shifted in a minute, and that this shift would drag out the chase and would change who would sit across from Geronimo when the next talk came. They did not make speeches about it. They packed their kit, checked their cartridges, and went down the trail. The ground remembered. At the Jaros River, the scorched circles where small fires had burned lay black under the winter sun. A woman retrieving what she could from the wreckage of the camp picked up a wooden spoon and turned it over in her hands as if it could tell her how many nights it had stirred the same pot. A boy found a scrap of blanket with a pattern his grandmother had woven and pushed it inside his shirt because a scrap carried hidden heat. Across the river, a line of horse prints bit deep into damp sand, a record of where the scouts had led captured stock away. The place where Crawford had stood on the rock bore a streak of blood washed thin by dew. The men who passed there after the fight were quiet and kept moving. All of it sharpened the edges of what would come. The families who had escaped the strike on the 10th felt wind where blankets had been and walked harder to make up for animals lost in the rush. The soldiers who had fired on the 11th carried their wounded away and explained their mistake to superiors who read papers with tight mouths. The United States officers counted what they had left and tallied how long their men could carry litters before legs gave out. The separate columns in the larger chase adjusted routes and times to the pace of events they had not chosen. And in the minds of men on both sides, the simple shape of an end that could have come with talk at a camp above a winter river bent into a shape that would take many months. More riders, more ground, and more hard choices to straighten. March 25th, 1886. Cold air lay in the tight bends of the Bavispe River as General George Crook brought his column into the narrows locals called Cañón de los Embudos, a place of steep walls, thin water, and gravel bars pocked by hoofprints that said Geronimo was watching from the stone above. The scouts moved first, hands on reins and fingers near triggers, eyes hunting for the small signs that mean a rifle waits behind a boulder. Crook rode with his aides in a file of Apache scouts whose faces showed no surprise at any of it. They had lived this country as boys and had fought across it as men. The canyon pinched sound, so the clink of bit chains and the creak of leather seemed louder than they were. Each echo reminded the command that the enemy knew every fold, every seep, and every line of approach. The United States camp settled on the river gravel with practiced economy. Pack mules were stripped and picketed. Sentries took posts that gave overlapping fields of fire up canyon and down. The interpreter repeated Crook's orders in steady Apache and Spanish, that no shot would be fired unless fired on, that women and children would be left strictly alone, that any meeting would happen in the open with the sun high and more than one set of eyes on every move. Men built small fires where wind would carry smoke straight up and not into the brush. The scouts who had tracked hard through Sonoran ridges laid out their blankets without comment and ate meat in small mouthfuls to make rations stretch. Each man put his carbine and belt where his hand could find them in darkness without groping. Geronimo and Naiche had let word ride ahead the previous evening that they would talk. Not surrender, not yet, but talk in daylight with all eyes open. The canyon was chosen because it let both sides count the other, and because escape routes ran off it like arroyos from a wash. The Chiricahua camp lay higher amid scrub oak and basalt, a scatter of brush shelters hidden in folds where the wind cut the smell of smoke. Their watchers had seen the blue blouses of soldiers and the mixed buckskins of Apache scouts snake into the narrows. The men above saw that Crook kept his formation loose enough to fight and tight enough to protect the pack line. They noted that his officers did not shout. They noted that the scouts set their backs to rock and did not turn their heads much when they listened. A photographer out of Tombstone named C.S. Fly had followed Crook in with boxes of glass plates, bottles for chemicals, and a folding camera that demanded patience and steadiness. He and his wife worked fast in a canvas dark tent, coating plates with sticky solution that had to be exposed while still wet, then fixed before dust fouled the surface. The camera stood on a spindly tripod on the gravel where it would not tip, pointed at the stretch of riverbed Crook suggested for the council. The presence of that machine changed nothing about the danger. It did fix faces and postures that many who were there wanted remembered, not because of pride, but because the chase had carried on long enough that proof of any meeting could anchor later words. By mid-morning, Naiche came down first with a few men to measure the ground and the mood. He stood tall, his face flat of expression, his gaze cutting from scout to sentinel and back. He carried himself like a man who had ridden hard under a pack and who intended to ride more. Behind him, Geronimo stepped out of the shade, boots scuffing gravel, a rifleman's eyes working the edges of every shadow. He carried no gun in hand, but belts told their own story. He wanted Crook to see that he did not come helpless. Crook stepped forward without flourish, hat brim low against the glare, hands out from his sides, not wide, not theatrical, only enough to show they were empty. No one shook hands. Voices met air that tasted of ash and damp stone. The talk began in measured tones and moved through interpreters in short blocks. Crook said every family needed to come in, and that every man who had left the reservation would be counted and fed, then sent where the government decided. He said that raiding across the border had brought a kind of attention that would not stop until the shooting stopped. He made no promises he could not keep. He used terms for food, rest, and safety that were plain. Geronimo answered that promised safety had been broken before, that men had been seized in the night and carried east, that he had left because confinement meant slow death in a place where hunger and whiskey and insult chewed at people until they were no longer themselves. He said he would not put his hands out for irons. He said his people would not be split from their families. He looked at the scouts in United States pay and said he knew every one of them and where they came from and how their families had been used as weight on a balance scale. The photographs caught an uneasy pause while Fly's lens stared. Men sat on saddles laid on gravel to keep from soaking pants in the damp. Rifles lay across laps, muzzles tilted down. The camera recorded Nietzsche seated with his knees high and his head cocked a little. Geronimo standing, other leaders arrayed, as if an unseen hand had set them for a formal view. A river stone lay at a boot tip like a small anchor. Behind them, soldiers and scouts kept their eyes on the slope lines and on the notches in the canyon rim where a rifleman could lay flat and still command the ground below. The resulting plates would show a meeting without embraces, a set of men holding themselves like springs that could uncoil with one bad word. Crook did not raise his voice. He spoke of practical things. He said there was food north of the line and grass for animals. He said that the United States would not tolerate more raids into ranches where men had to sleep with a rifle across a chair, and where women woke at every creak of lumber because the memory of cut, fences, and dead stock kept them from full rest. He said he would see Chiricahua families guarded across the line to a place of safety. He did not promise a specific reservation by name. He did not name Florida because the decision on permanent imprisonment had not been written in the orders he carried. He did say that once the rifles were stacked and the ammunition handed over, he would be responsible for their lives until higher officers took charge. Geronimo listened, and then spoke of a dead captain in Mexico whose fall had shredded the thin cloth of trust. He did not say the name of Emmett Crawford, but the meaning was clear. He said that a fight that should not have happened had sent a message that if a mistake could kill a commander, what would a mistake do to men and women who had no rank? He said that when a man has to choose between a desert with thin water and a camp with a guardhouse and a ledger keeper who counts children as rations, he watches the sky for hawks instead of smoke. He pointed at the canyon walls and said they knew this ground, that they could part like a covey if they had to, that his people could live on less than soldiers thought possible. He did not bluff. He stated what the past year had proved many times. In the afternoon, Crook sent word for rations to be brought to the river edge for the families who were below safe strength. Meal, coffee, and a little beef moved by mule to a neutral strip on the gravel. No one pushed forward. Small groups stepped out in turns, collected what they could carry, and backed away with eyes never leaving the opposite line. Soldiers stood out of arm's reach and kept hands off weapons while the exchange happened. Scouts watched the slope to keep any hothead from rushing the food and starting a panic that could not be stopped. The scene ran like clockwork, wound by fear and by discipline. A child took a cup and drank as if thirsty had become the only solid thing in the world. The day ended without a signature. It ended with an agreement to meet again the next morning, to bring more families into the open, to have a final word on whether the entire band would cross the line into the United States under Crook's guard. Men slept in shifts that night, each with a saddle under his head and his rifle laid along his side. The canyon wind dropped at midnight and the air went dead cold. Fly worked plates by lantern light when he could, then gave up and closed his tent to keep dust from ruining everything he had already taken. The smell of collodion stayed in the mouth after the light went out. March 26th began with a faint mist on the river stones. Geronimo came down again with Nietzsche and a few more men who had not shown themselves the day before. He said he wanted proof that families would not be separated. Crook said that the women and children who came in would not be left unguarded in any town, that they would be escorted to a post and kept together, that they would be moved by rail. When orders came, that no man would be taken out and shot. The interpreters worked hard to keep every clause straight. Crook's aide, an officer who kept his notebooks close and his sentences exact, wrote down names, numbers, and conditions as they were spoken. He tallied families ready to move and mounts needed to carry them. He sized the escort he would need on the road to Fort Bowie and beyond. In the background, scouts spoke with kinsmen across the gravel in quiet exchanges that carried more weight than any formal speech. A man who had taken United States pay explained in low tone how the army fed families on the march, how the wagons moved, how the guard detail worked on the trail, how the surgeon treated the sick, how rations were measured, how sharp the eyes of sentries were when sleep was in short supply, and what to do when a teamster tried to talk behind an officer's back. None of this was romantic language. It was logistics. It was how to move a people from a canyon in Sonora to a post in Arizona without anyone dying on the trail who did not already have death in him. The photographs from that day showed steadier faces, not because anyone had softened, but because repetition made both sides know the beats. One plate caught Geronimo looking just past the lens, something like calculation fixed in his eyes. Another captured Naiche seated with a blanket thrown back from his shoulders, bare chest catching light, his expression so controlled it looked cut from stone. A third framed Crook as a compact figure seated on a saddle laid on gravel, hat brim giving shade, boots planted flat, posture that of a man built to sit a horse for days without complaint. Behind him stood Apache scouts, some in store shirts, some in cloth that had been traded a dozen times before landing on their backs, each man holding himself ready to spring toward cover if a rifle barked from the rim. By late day, Crook believed he had an understanding. He told Geronimo to move his people to a camp closer to the river, to be ready to march toward the line the following morning. He ordered his own camp to issue more rations under guard and to prepare pack stock for a slow column that would keep families together. He set sentries where they could see the enemy camp smoke twisting into the blue without losing sight of the mule strings. He sent couriers north with messages that said he expected to bring in the holdouts, that feed and transport should be ready, that any officer with business to delay the movement should put his orders in writing and sign them clear. As the sun dropped, a faint unease moved like a draft through the canyon. Word came down that some men in Geronimo's camp were muttering about being marched past Mexican outposts that still wanted revenge, about being lined up at some fort gate and counted in a way that ended in irons. A scout returning from the slope said he had seen pairs of figures slipping along the rim as if measuring the dark. Crookie tightened his pickets and told his officers to hold the men ready. But he did not break the fragile rhythm by pushing closer to the hostile camp. He had seen more than one negotiation wrecked by a single nervous move. March 27th opened tense. Women and children began to drift down from the upper camp, each with bundles tied in ways that suggested they had tied and untied the same knots many times before. Some men lugged sacks of corn and strips of dried meat. Others carried nothing but a rifle and a blanket because they planned to walk light no matter what the day brought. Crook directed where to stack arms for counting and where to put families who would be escorted first. He told his officers to keep the first wagon path open and to set the escort in 2 ranks instead of 1 so that if a horse bolted, a file would still stand. He told the photographer to keep his camera far enough back to avoid another kind of panicked stampede, the kind caused when a lens swings suddenly and a nervous man thinks it is a weapon. The talk that morning ran in circles. Geronimo pressed again about what would happen once they crossed to the United States side. Crook repeated that they would be taken to a post and that he would turn them over to the authority set above him, that he would insist the families stay together, that any binding terms would be written down. He made as plain as he could that he would conduct them to safety as far as his orders allowed. It was precise language. It was also not what a hunted man wanted to hear when he measured his life in creek beds and days. The circle widened as more men from the Chiricahua camp came down, watched, and then drifted back up the slope with low remarks to their friends. Near midday, a small commotion rose from the upper camp. A boy cried out and a man barked a command, then someone laughed with an edge that did not sound like humor. Scouts stiffened. Crook kept his eyes on Geronimo and Naiche. He did not turn. He knew that turning at the wrong moment made men who watched him think his fear had arrived before his orders. He spoke quietly to an aide to increase the spacing between the first group of families and the next, not to scatter them, but to keep a clear line of sight for the escort. He told the interpreter to make sure those about to move knew where they would be taken for the first halt north of the line and who would stand watch while they slept. Afternoon light showed weariness on every face. Decisions grind men down when every outcome looks bad. Geronimo's eyes tracked every small change in the United States camp. Naiche looked often at the higher ground behind him, counting the men who still waited out of sight. The canyon swallowed words and returned them a little flatter and harder. No shot was fired. No man ran. The families already on the lower gravel stayed where they were, holding tight to what they had decided at dawn. The rest held back in a tension so taut that a dropped coffee cup would have sounded like a rifle crack. As dusk gathered, Crook sent a last message up the slope that he would begin the escort at first light. He ordered an extra ring of sentries and told the scouts on the flanks to keep awake by any means needed. He instructed that fires be cut to the bone and that coffee, not whiskey, wet men's throats. He said out loud to his staff that he would move at a pace that matched the slowest family, that no one would be left in a gap between the two sides for outsiders to peel off and kill. He sent another courier north to say he expected to cross the line with a column of families and a separate column of armed men walking without rifles in their hands. Night fell hard in the canyon. The river whispered over stones. A thin frost began to paint shadows white. The orders were simple and repeated, that every man sleep with his gear set for an immediate stand, that no one fire at a shadow, that any alarm be passed in the fewest words possible so that panic did not breed within the United States camp. Up on the rim, small shapes moved, then stilled, then moved again, as the men in Geronimo's camp walked their own line of decision. Counting children, counting horses, counting the brutal math of a march under guard against the brutal math of another flight into the mountains. No one in the canyon thought the danger had passed. Every man who lay down that night knew that morning would either bring the first ordered step of a crossing or the sudden emptiness that follows when a camp dissolves into the dark and leaves only the cold of trampled gravel and the memory of voices that had not said enough. March 30th, 1886. The canyon lay quiet before dawn, a thin chill on the Bavispe water and a pale smear of light behind the black rim. In the United States camp, men rose to warm coffee in shallow cups and to roll blankets tight for a march that General George Crook intended to start at full light. In the Chiricahua camp above, bundles were already tied with rawhide thongs, but not for the road Crook planned. Geronimo had walked the rock shelves for half the night with Naiche and Yanoja, stopping at points where sound carries, then moving on, counting the watchers along the rim and the safe gaps between them. He measured the distance to the first fold of ground that hides hoofbeats, the slope that breaks a silhouette, and the gravel bar where prints can be scattered with a branch. The night before had not settled into trust. Men had argued in low voices about what would happen once the column crossed north, about guardhouses and trains, about whether families would stay together, about whether a promise spoken in a riverbed would hold in a fort office. A few young men had found drink, a rough brew that burns and loosens tempers, and there had been a flare of anger before elders pushed them down to sit and keep quiet. That scrape, small as it was, sent the kind of warning through the camp that old fighters hear with their skin. When men on edge start to reach for weapons over words, nothing good comes next. Geronimo did not need another sign. He already knew what he would do. Before first light, he spoke in short sentences that left no room for confusion. The party would split in stages so that no single clump could be trapped. Each small group would take a line mapped by landmarks that only kin would recognize. A stand of twisted oak, a dark stain on a cliff face, a basalt knob that looks like a crouched animal from one angle and like nothing at all from another. Children would move on the inner edges. Women would carry packs balanced across both sides of the animals. Men would range outward and then collapse back in at crossings where flanks are cut off by stone. There would be no shots, no shouts, no calls by name that would carry down to the river. If a horse stumbled, the man at the lead would cut the rope and keep moving, then circle back later if there was time. No one would stop to gather what fell from a pack. The first group slid off the slope while the canyon still held night. Sand hissed under moccasins. A woman steadied a child with a hand at the back of his neck and guided him through scrub that slapped at his legs. A boy carried a small pot by its bail and kept the iron from clicking on stone by holding it still against his thigh with his other hand. The second group moved as soon as the shadow swallowed the first. Men at the rear picked up brush and dragged it lightly across the raw scuffs where hooves had bitten deeper than planned. At the rim, a watcher coughed once and then was still, counting the seconds between the last man passing and the first man losing sight in the lower fold. The last group went as the lowest part of the eastern sky turned the color that comes before color. Geronimo and Naiche came with that last group, not because it was safest, but because the tale tells the story of the whole when things go wrong. Down on the river gravel, Crook's camp woke to orders and to the ordinary frictions of a force getting ready to move families across bad ground. Pack saddles had to be fitted to mules that never liked them. Ration sacks had to be counted and divided into daily issues. Sentries had to be relieved and then sent to eat in turn. The photographer, C.S. Fly, crawled from his canvas dark tent and started to stow plates and bottles, careful not to wave a hand in ways that could spook men with rifles. Crook told his aides to ready the first escort for the families who had already come down, to place Apache scouts at the front of each file, and to keep the road wide open for the armed men who would follow without rifles in their hands. He wanted the column to move like a rope drawn tight between two trees, with no slack where panic could not. At the exact moment that the first detail reached for the hobbled mules in the upper Chiricahua camp, a whistle sounded far up the slope, thin and quick, a bird call that does not sit in this canyon in March. It was not loud, but the men who had been told to listen for it heard. The last rope slipped from a post. A rawhide thong snapped and flopped in the air. Geronimo nodded to Yanoja, then put his hand flat on a horse's neck and stepped off the ledge onto a line of beveled stone that leads to a narrow saddle no one below could see. Men eased down the same path one by one and vanished into a cut that smelled of wet rock and crushed sage. The country above the Bavispe is a ladder that tilts toward the Sierra Madre. Each rung is a ridge or bench, with slides of gravel between that roll if a man moves too fast. The party gained the first bench without a misplaced step. There they went to ground for a count, each head called in a voice just loud enough for the next man to hear. The missing were only the ones planned to peel off at the earlier turn. From that bench, the line angled along a contour where a horse can walk without pitching forward, then cut behind a bulge of basalt and into a stand of black oak. The first real risk came where the path crossed open stone with no cover and where sound travels like dropped iron. Men walking there held reins high and set each hoof with care. Women went in the middle of that run, faces set, eyes never dropping to the emptiness below. Back at the river, a sentry looking up from a saddle cinch thought he saw a speck detach from the shadow near the rim and move across it. He blinked and looked again. The speck was gone. He told his corporal. The corporal told a lieutenant. The lieutenant climbed onto a boulder and lifted a field glass. He saw nothing but scrub and stone. He lowered the glass and took 3 slow breaths, then raised it again. This time he caught a flick of movement that made no sense, something there and then not there. He climbed down and went at a trot to find Crook. The general listened without a word, then looked up at the empty slope and said to send scouts to the pickets above, not to the upper camp itself. Not yet. The second bench held an old game trail that dropped into a notch and then ran along a seam where water sometimes seeps in summer. It was a kind of road if a man had the nerves and the balance to use it. Not a place to make time, but a place to erase distance from pursuit. At the notch, Geronimo signaled a brief halt. He put 2 men on the rim with rifles ready to hold, long enough to let the column make the next fold. He sent 2 others with a branch to brush out the worst of the prints where damp sand had held heel marks too clearly. Nietzsche moved among the women and spoke in a low voice that carried calm rather than hurry. The party started again as the light deepened by a shade that was neither night nor day. Coyotes cried far off. A hawk rode a swaying line in the air above the first tall ridge. On the gravel bar, a scout named to lead the right flank came in at a run and told Crook that the upper camp sounded wrong. No morning talk, no wood crackle, no pot ring. He had crept close enough to hear only the kind of echo you get in empty ground. Crook's face did not change. He told the man to take 2 more scouts and to climb to the exact rocks where they had watched the camp yesterday. He told a second party to circle left and check the path that comes down to the water where animals go to drink. He told his quartermaster to keep loading and to hold the families already on the gravel where they were. He did not want a sudden halt to spread fear for no reason, but he would not move a file into an empty basket. The third bench demanded choices. 1 line cut toward a saddle where the rock breaks into steps that a mule can take with a firm hand on its halter. Another line went into a narrow throat where the walls crowd in so tight that a man must turn his shoulders. The party took the saddle. A boy slipped on a patch of frost and would have fallen if a woman had not caught his belt and held him until he found the next place to put his feet. A mule balked at the first step and put its head up and made that thin noise they make when fear rises. Yanoja laid a hand on the halter and spoke quiet and slow, and the mule set its forefeet and came up. The men put their bodies against the rear of the packs to keep the load from dragging the animal backward. Up and over, then down into a pocket where the ground held old ash and the smell of summer rains. The scouts reached the upper camp and found cold ashes, blank ground where bundles had been stacked the day before, and prints that went out in 3 distinct lines. One of the scouts crouched and put his finger to a heel, scuff, then to his tongue. He rose and told the others that the last man had passed in the hour before the pale light showed on the rim. They moved along the nearest line until it split into smaller drifts of prints, a break that turns a single trail into work multiplied by 10. They backed out and ran, loose and sure on ground where a small twist can break an ankle, their breath fogging in front of their mouths. They brought the news to Crook on the river just as the sun fired the far ridge. Crook took the blow without moving his feet. He ordered pursuit parties out at once, small and fast, not to fight, only to stay close enough to pin the enemy to a direction. He placed Apache scouts at the head of each pursuit and told the white officers to keep their men from pressing rashly into ground the enemy could fold back onto them. He sent a rider to tell the packmaster to stand down the first escort. He called his staff together and spoke in a voice that carried across the gravel without strain. The band had gone. The day's plan was dead. The work now was to keep families already in hand safe, to hold the lower camp secure and to adjust routes and supplies for a chase that had no set road. By midday, Geronimo's party had crossed into folds of land that blocked both sight and sound. They moved with a rhythm that veterans fall into without thinking, a pattern of steady pace, brief halt, scan, then steady pace again. At a seep hidden under a lip of stone, women knelt and worked sticks into wet sand to lift water into cups, then into skins. Men stood facing outward with rifles at a low carry. A girl ate a strip of dried meat and watched a beetle crawl over the top of her shoe. A boy leaned against a rock and slept for a count of 20 breaths, then woke at a whisper and lifted his small pack without complaint. No one told stories. No one promised anything. The single fact that mattered was distance. The pursuit parties hit the first tricks in the sign as soon as they climbed out of the canyon. Brush had been dragged in ways that do not fool a good tracker for long, but that do steal minutes, and minutes add up. Rock shelves bore scuffs at their edges that said men had stepped onto stone to break the line, then had hopped to a patch of gravel where the sign was easy to smear. One place showed 2 sets of prints laid heel to toe in opposite directions, a simple knot meant to waste time while men looked for which was real. The scouts who followed saw the work, spat dust, and cut off the trail at angles that cut the tricks short. They read the ground like a page filled with bad handwriting, not pretty to look at, but legible to those who knew the letters. Toward afternoon, the fugitives reached a higher band of country where the wind keeps scents low to the ground and where thin pines stand apart like posts. The party strung out a little on a shallow rise and then tightened again as the path narrowed between 2 low boulders. A woman shifted a baby from one hip to the other and hissed once when a thorn came through a sandal. A man tied a rawhide repair on a pack strap that had started to fray under weight. Geronimo walked the line and looked at faces. He spoke few words, only names and short directions. Keep left at the black stump. Hold until the 2 dead piñons drop into the wash and stay in it for 20 steps before climbing the left bank. Nietzsche counted horses by color and mark, then counted them again without looking down, eyes always on the horizon line. In the United States, Camp Crook dictated a message that rode north at once. It said that the Chiricahua leaders had abandoned the march at first light, that 3 pursuit parties were out, that more would follow as soon as he could strip enough men from the guard on the families who had already come in. It asked for feed at points where pursuit would need it, for fresh mounts pushed forward and for wagons ready to move when the direction of the chase settled. It did not waste words on blame. It held to the work at hand. He ordered the photographer to pack and prepare to move out with a guard to the nearest post because glass plates are of no use in a running chase, and because a civilian with a load like that becomes an anchor that others must carry. Late in the day, Geronimo chose a line that led to a saddle opening toward foothills that the men knew from boyhood. He put his best walkers at the front, not to pull pace, but to cut choice, to set the exact path that takes the least out of horses and people. He put 2 men with sure hands on lead ropes for the heaviest laden mules. He placed a boy who never complains midway down the line to act as a measure. If he stumbled, the pace was wrong. If he hummed a few notes to himself under his breath without losing step, the pace could push a little more. A woman slipped a pebble out of her sandal and tucked it in her palm as if it were a thing to be saved. The party topped the saddle and saw the first long backs of the Sierra Madre proper, the country that folds into itself for days, the country that once entered offers more exits than any map can show. The first pursuit party reached a ridge from which dust winked on the far horizon. They stopped to glass it and to argue whether that dust rose from stock or wind. The scout with the oldest eyes said stock, slow-moving, burdened, with too even a line for wild cattle. They angled to cut it off and then saw another dust far to the right, then a third. The band had done what Geronimo wanted. It had thrown 3 screens for the price of 1. The white officer in that party swore under his breath, then called for a push on the middle dust, gambling that bread carries in that line because water lies that way. The gamble was not foolish, but it burned horses and men without closing the gap. Night took the high country sudden and hard. The fugitives moved until they could not place their feet without too much noise. then went to ground in a cut where scrub breaks the wind. Fires were not lit. Cold food went down like stones. Children were wedged into blanket rolls and covered by the curve of a mother's shoulder. Men lay with rifles along legs and with cartridge belts under cheeks to make a pillow that is also a promise. Geronimo stood for a while, a dark shape against darker rock, listening for the far clink that means iron on stone, for the burst of a voice that means a foolish soldier has spoken when he was told to keep silent. He heard only the small noises that all living things make when they sleep on hard ground. He lay down last. At first light on March 31st, the party moved again without a word. Breath plumed. Frost glazed the highest grass blades. A man at the rear took 4 strides backward and brushed the sign with a branch, then broke the branch and dropped it where it would confuse no one but a green tracker. The trail ran through black rock that grabs at moccasins and tears edges. A woman paused to adjust the pad under a rawhide pack frame and then signaled that she was ready. A boy pointed at a notch on a distant ridge and asked if that was the gate to the Mother Range. His uncle said yes, not because of poetry, but because naming a target sets a distance that can be closed. By midday of that next day, the line had slipped past the easy reach of any fast party from Crook's camp. The pursuit now depended on fresh mounts and on the ability of scouts to hold sign in country that swallows it. Crook knew what that meant and said it out loud to his officers so there would be no misunderstanding. This was no longer a march with a schedule. This was a chase that would test every man who kept a saddle warm. He ordered his messengers to ride on to posts where he could draw more scouts and more animals. He wrote the day's facts in his book in a tight hand, then closed it and looked at the empty upper camp one last time. There is no virtue in staring at a place where decisions have already been made. In the higher hills, the party found a seep that a man could drink from if he had the patience to wait for the water to gather in a shallow cup of stone. They took turns in order, not by rank, but by need. The older ones sat with backs against warm rock while the young eyes watched the edges. Nietzsche spoke with 2 men about the line that would take them into the first real folds of the Sierra Madre proper. A defile that keeps sound low and that carries a man in the lee of the wind for most of a day. Geronimo listened, then nodded once, a single movement that said their math matched his. Nothing else needed saying. As the sun fell on March 31st, the last of the party slid through that defile and into another set of options. The choice to break away from Cañón de los Embudos had cost time, strength, and blood held tight in veins by control alone. It had gained the only thing that matters to hunted people: room to move. The open ground between them and the United States. Camp now lay behind, not as safety but as proof that the river meeting had ended without the road Crook had written in his head. The next names that would matter were not the river and the photographer and the general, but the long ridges of the Mother Range, the little towns on the Mexican side that watched riders pass with no desire to speak their names, and the scattered water that keeps people alive when plans run out. The break did not end the chase. It defined the next phase. Men in United States blue would ride and count and send signals off mirrors that blink across miles of air. Men in buckskins and shirts bought somewhere 3 seasons ago would answer with the oldest tools they knew. Legs that keep moving, eyes that measure the ground 4 steps ahead, and the hard resolve to accept hunger and cold over the certainty of a guardhouse and a rail car. The Sierra Madre opened in front of them like a set of doors that only the men who stood there knew how to unlock. They did not waste the key on words. They spent it in miles. April 1st, 1886. The order moved by wire before sun climbed the Tucson Flats, a short message that ended General George Crook's tenure and put Brigadier General Nelson Appleton Miles in charge of the Department of Arizona. Clerks at Fort Lowell copied the language in a stiff hand and sent runners to wake staff who had slept in field clothes. A horse stamped in the parade ground dust while an orderly folded Crook's last circular and slid it into a leather pouch. By late morning, the rooms that smelled of old coffee and ink had a new center of gravity. Miles stepped in with a campaign hat set low and the kind of energy that makes subordinates square their shoulders without a word. He had read every dispatch on the long ride south, memorizing names, distances, and the feel of a fight gone thin through the fingers. He knew the March Council on the Bavispe had failed to convert talk into a column under guard. He knew the canyon called Cañón de los Embudos as a place on a map, and as a hinge in a story that had swung the wrong way. He knew the winter chase had left companies scattered across hard country with mounts worn to the hair, and scouts counting cartridges by touch in the dark. He started where men like him always start, with paper maps and orders that change the rhythm of a department before the first patrol saddles. He set his desk at Fort Lowell for the moment, then pushed a field headquarters forward. Fort Huachuca would serve as the advance base where columns would form, feed would be staged, and the signal corps could reach the high points that see far in clear air. Fort Bowie would carry the rear load, the rail, and the heavier stores, a place where telegraph keys clicked without lag and where wagons could be turned quickly. Officers who had drifted into habits under the old command found that those habits no longer fit. Miles did not depend on long negotiations with men who slid away at dusk. He wanted pressure measured in miles marched, stations linked by light, and patrol lines pulled tight across the routes to water. He pulled rosters and laid them against the map like weights. 4th Cavalry stood high on the list, with Captain Henry W. Lawton marked as the man to take the field command that rode longest and asked the most from horses and men. 6th Cavalry, 8th Cavalry, and a cut of infantry companies would anchor posts and push into the foothills when ordered. He sent for medical officers who did more than count bandages. Surgeon Leonard Wood reported to the forward base with the same calm stride he used in the hospital tent. Miles put his finger on points that needed surgeons and told his staff that men would not be bled out by neglect when the work ahead would already strip them to sinew. He wrote in plain language that scouts would still be used where they gave clear advantage, but that the main weight would ride with regular troops who answered to a chain of command without divided loyalties. The Apache scouts in United States pay had value none could deny. Their eyes read sign at a glance. Their legs never seemed to tire. Their knowledge of seeps and saddles could not be taught in a season. Miles did not insult that value. He narrowed it. Scouts would screen, probe, and point. Regulars would close. He made it clear that the line of authority would not bend in the field when a decision had to be made at a rock shelf with daylight running out. He called in his chief quartermaster and pointed at the long, empty spaces between posts. Grain on the ground keeps columns moving. Without it, men ride horses into the red and then stare at saddles that sit on animals too blown to stand. Pack trains had to be rebuilt where winter duty had broken backs and legs. Harness had to be mended with rawhide and rivets, not string. Miles ordered depot officers to pull sound mules out of every corner of the department and push them south. He told them to stack barley and hard bread at points his staff circled on the map, not just at posts, but at drags and passes where patrols could swing wide and still be fed. He turned to the signal corps next. Mirrors and shutters would do what marching orders alone never could in this country. Mountain stations would talk to one another across clear sky at distances no rider could cover in an afternoon. He directed officers to survey peaks and ridge lines from the Santa Ritas to the Dragoons and on into New Mexico, to build a chain of stations that could pass a message from the Mexican line to posts that held relief columns or feed. Operators would be rotated so their hands stayed steady and their eyes did not dull. Guard details would be posted at every heliograph point because a single rifleman with time and patience can silence a station and blind a valley. He brought in the department's telegraphers and had them tap the keys until wires sang end to end. The words that moved through copper were few, sharp, and stripped of ornament. Posts would report mounts fit to travel today, not next week. Captains would mark the number of rounds on each belt as of dusk, not the theoretical count on some monthly sheet. Couriers would carry duplicates because desert storms cut lines without warning. No one would ride into the Sierra Madre thin on information again if a mirror, a wire, or a runner could bridge the gap. He met each senior captain without ceremony, looking at boots, eyes, and hands worn by reins rather than at collar ornaments. He set expectations with the steadiness of a man who has lived through long campaigns. Patrols would move in echelons, not single strings, so that one troop could relieve another without giving the chased band a single free night. Routes would bend toward water every day, not every other day, because a man who rides thirsty makes poor decisions and a horse that drinks late becomes a corpse in a canyon. Columns would pass information laterally as well as back to base. A dust plume on a far ridge would not be a mystery to the next troop if a mirror could blink a sentence into their hands. He laid out rules about talk. Parley would be accepted only when it walked into an advantage already won on the ground. No council would happen deep in a gorge that gives the other side 4 exits and the United States none. No promises would be spoken beyond authority written and signed. Families would be protected when they came under the guard of a column, but the fight would not be paused without cause. The weeks ahead would be a grind, not an exchange of speeches. He sent messengers to stage contractors and to the men who ran freight strings out of Tucson and Benson. Civilian wagons would move forward supplies to points that Army teams could not reach fast enough. Drivers were told that guards would ride with their loads and that feed and flour would be paid for in full without delay at the next station. He wrote to post commanders that the Army's coin would not be seen to cheat a man who risked his team on roads watched by raiders. He stepped through the hospitals and corrals at Fort Huachuca when he moved the advance headquarters there. He looked at the eyes of horses that had been pushed to the edge all winter and ordered the worst ones pulled from line and rested despite protests from lieutenants who loved speed more than sense. He inspected saddles for cracked trees that would lame a fresh mount in a single day. He told the farrier to heat the forge and keep it hot until midnight if that was what it took to put sound iron on every hoof that would leave tomorrow. He pulled Captain Lawton into a room that smelled of tallow and dust and gave him the shape of what the next months would be. Lawton would take a mixed command deep into Sonora and Chihuahua, riding in a wide arc that denied the enemy rest. He would keep the band moving until the body cannot answer the will, until sleep becomes a thing men dream about with open eyes. He would rotate remounts forward, not drag spent animals behind. He would pull water from rock with labor parties before dusk, not trust to luck at midnight. He would not entangle himself with civil authorities who wanted a parade more than a result. If he needed to talk, he would talk through an officer who knew the language and the customs of the men across the fire. When he needed an emissary who could look Geronimo in the face without flinching, a name would be offered at the right time. He spoke with officers who had ridden under Crook and told them their service was noted. Then told them plainly that the department would not repeat the pattern of councils that end with empty ground at dawn. He took the measure of lieutenants who had seen friends fall in the Jaros River country when uniforms were not recognized at first light. He put those men where their experience would count, on flanks and in the first files, not behind desks. He did not erase what had been. He redirected it. He sent a circular that reached every company street in the department by the following day. Drills would run again for skirmish lines in broken ground. Carbines would be fired and cleaned with care enough to keep extractors from sticking at the worst moment. Revolver practice would be done at ranges that matched canyon fights. not on neat targets set at comfortable distances. Saddle sores would be treated early. Men would carry spare shoes for mounts, rations measured for the days ahead, and canteens topped before sunrise whether they felt thirst or not. Sergeant majors would enforce without drama the kind of discipline that keeps a column from coming apart after 20 hours in the saddle. He reviewed arrest logs at posts across Arizona Territory and New Mexico for whiskey sellers and the kind of camp followers who live on the edge of any moving force. The next phase would not be padded with noise, tales, and drink. Traders with army contracts were warned that the guardhouse waited for anyone skimming grain or peddling rotgut near the camps. Companies caught with bottles in bedrolls would feel the weight of a general who did not mind being called hard, when hard meant fewer graves on the line to the border. He ordered officers to build lists of water, not the vague kind men carry in their heads, but lists written and copied with notes on taste, flow, shade, and the wind that blows through each draw. He wanted the name of every seep and the hours when it gives most, the condition of every spring box, the slope of every approach where horses break at the knee if a rider lets reins loose. He told them to mark dead ground that looks safe, and kill zones that lie quiet until you stand in them. He told them to draw lines of march that fold back on themselves at angles that catch a fleeing band between two quiet jaws. He met briefly with officers who knew Lieutenant Charles B. Gatewood and asked questions that carried into the quiet that follows when a room empties. Who could carry a message alone through the Sierra Madre and be invited into a hostile fire for a talk? Who could sit cross-legged with a man who had watched too many promises rot and still be believed when he spoke the terms of a general? Miles filed the answers where only he could reach them and said nothing more about it. The field would decide when to use such a man. He stood at the door of the Huachuca headquarters at evening and watched the dragoons catch the last light. The wind shifted and brought the flat iron smell of the forge and the dry tang of mesquite smoke from company kitchens. A file of recruits clattered past, too loud, bridles too loose. A first sergeant peeled out of shadow and fixed that with a glance that would have bent iron. Miles did not smile. He did not frown. He measured pace and posture and filed it away. He listened to the Signal Corps lieutenant sketch the first string of heliograph posts on a map spread across a packing crate. Peaks had names the Army used and names the older people used. Both sets were written down. The lieutenant marked distances in miles that men would have to walk with sections of instrument and crates of glass, then back with messages burned onto paper by acid fumes and speed. Miles told him to set dates for completion that were not guesses, to pull mules and guards without apology, and to report outages within the hour when a station went dark. He told him to send men to Bowie Peak early and to Huachuca Peak at once. Dust would rise from those trails by morning. He approved a schedule of night alarms at posts near the rail line. Men would learn to come to arms in silence. Saddles would be thrown on in the dark without buckles missed and cinches left loose. A troop that can move in 10 minutes in the black can close a gap that would otherwise take a day. Buglers were told that calls would be used sparingly in the field because brass carries over stone like truth shouted in a church. Orders would pass from mouth to ear on the line, not from horn to canyon. He sent letters to civil authorities in Tucson, Bisbee, and the smaller towns that sit under dust like coins forgotten on a shelf. Civilians were told that patrols would pass at odd hours. Road crossings would be held for trains of pack animals. Telegraph offices would get priority at any hour when military traffic needed the wire. Sheriffs would be advised before troops moved through their streets, not asked. The War Department's authority would be visible without swagger. He gave time to a short list of men who had tracked long for Crook and now stood unsure of their place. They were Apache scouts whose faces showed lines deeper than their years. He told each man through an interpreter where he was expected to ride and who would command him. He did not pretend that trust was simple. He made expectations simple instead. The men nodded once and bowed out, their shoulders telling less than their eyes. They would do what they were paid to do until someone took the pay away. He understood the calculation and planned around it. He reviewed the winter casualty sheets in private, tracing a finger down columns of names and brief lines that say how a man left a fight or a stretcher. He read the notes on the death of Captain Emmett Crawford more than once and let the anger cool into purpose. The kind of mistake that kills a commander kills momentum with him. The kind of confusion that puts United States officers in the sights of men who should have been friends at dawn eats a campaign from the inside. His orders would reduce confusion by reducing chances for error. Columns would not camp where another force could mistake them. Flags would be set where they could be seen at first light. Pickets would be doubled when neighbors slept near. He rode out to look at the first detachments forming on the Huachuca Flats. Troops stood by fours in dust that had not yet lifted in heat. Bits jingled. A mule hitched to a forge wagon laid his ears back and studied the horizon with the hate only mules can manage. Lawton's men checked carbine slings and looked at their captain without asking the questions that hang around any fresh push. Miles sat his horse long enough to be seen and short enough not to turn the review into a parade. He told Lawton in a voice that did not carry beyond the nearest file that the chase would be arithmetic, not theatrics. He watched packers load panniers with flour, beans, coffee, salt, and a few small luxuries that keep men from turning savage in their heads. Tobacco measured in tight twists. A handful of dried fruit for a night when rain traps a column under canvas, and a roll of canvas itself to keep a surgeon's hands out of the dust. He told the packmaster to load even, to keep a hand on the scale and to throw any man off the line who tried to sneak an extra sack onto a friend's string. A crooked load breaks a mule and with it a day's march. He reviewed the boundary protocol and made sure every captain could recite it. When a column crossed into Mexico, it would do so under clear orders, with word to commanders on both sides of the line as fast as wheels and wires could carry it. Civilians along the border would be told only what they needed to hear. No ripples thrown into still water to please the curious. No boasting over bar counters that carry everything said to ears that should not hear it. A general who rides deep into another nation's ridges has to make his own weather. He would do that with speed and discretion more than with paper. He stood in the doorway after dark with a lantern blowing smoke in slow curls and thought in numbers as much as in names. The goal was to make the enemy choose between two bad choices every day. If the band tried to rest, a column would find sign and force them up again. If they ran hard, they would run into a line cut in front of them by orders sent the day before. If they turned for water, a mirror's blink would pull a troop toward that same water. If they tried for old caches in the Sierra Madre, men who had lived there once would be waiting on the shelves above. He did not promise a single decisive fight. He made sure everyone under him understood that. This would be pressure measured in days and in the sound of boots on stone at hours when a man's mind starts to wander. He would take away rest, pattern, and news. The band would look for safe places and find them already held. It would look for known paths and find them watched. It would look for friends and find doors closed by fear of rail cars waiting in far places by wide water. He signed the last paper at Huachuca near midnight and told the adjutant that the next circular would be shorter. Orders should not be longer than a man can remember on a bad day. He slept on a cot that squeaked when he shifted and woke once to the sound of a far horse snorting at some coyote joke beyond the picket line. He was up before dawn, booted, belted, and ready to turn plans into the kind of labor that makes plans matter. At first light, columns moved off in measured silence, the files straight, the spacing right, the pack strings stepping into dust with ears tilted toward men who knew their names. The flags that mattered were not the colors rolled on poles at the head of a troop, but the small squares of polished glass that would wink from peaks before noon and after, passing short sentences that would shape miles. The men at the tail of each column settled into saddles that would not forgive softness. The men at the head put their eyes on the low cuts in the land where water would be. The department had changed hands. The country had not changed its character. The chase that began again under new orders would be decided by the same old facts: food, horses, water, and the will to keep going when it would be easier to stop. July 1st, 1886. Orders went out from the forward desks with lines that left no room for delay. And by mid-morning, men in the signal corps were measuring crates, weighing mirrors, and counting shutter arms on tables that smelled of oil and dust. Teamsters backed wagons to loading ramps at Fort Huachuca and Fort Bowie. Quartermasters signed for tripods, heliograph kits, canvas windbreaks, field telegraph spools, repair files, spare glass, and message blanks sealed in tins. The push had one purpose. A chain of daylight eyes would reach from the Santa Rita country through the Dragoons and Chiricahuas into New Mexico, so a sighting on one ridge could become an order on another before a tired horse could drink. The men who would make light talk in code were not showpieces. They were carpenters' sons and farmhands who had learned to stand on bad footing without fidgeting. Each team carried a mirror that measured a handspan across, a sighting bar with a front and rear vane, a drop shutter that cut light clean, and a small black box of tools. The instrument broke into padded pieces for a pack saddle. When set up on stone, it looked slight until the sun lifted and a pulse cut the far air in hard white blinks. Operators spoke in short sentences and guarded their fingertips because a chipped edge or greasy smear on glass could swallow a message and turn a day's work into a lost chance. Pack strings left the parade grounds with signal kits lashed atop barley and hard bread. Infantry details climbed on foot, rifles slung and hands free to catch at rock. Cavalrymen led lead horses up slopes too steep to ride. At each chosen point, the crew fitted the 3 legs of a tripod into shallow stone cuts hacked with a cold chisel, ran a level, and tightened wing nuts until metal rang. A canvas shield went up if wind made the mirror chatter. An assistant cracked the field chest and laid out the code sheet in the book of station calls because the first test across open miles would not forgive a stumble. When the instrument stood firm, the operator sighted the next peak and waited for a glint to answer back. By noon, the first line from Huachuca Peak answered Fort Bowie's signal peak in clean bursts that counted letters. The distance was more than a day's march in hard country, yet the words landed whole in a few breaths. In the afternoon, a farther link answered from a shoulder above the San Pedro. The chatter moved in a rhythm no rider could match, with stations repeating each block to confirm receipt. When dust rose on the flats below, a lookout at a lower post read the shapes with his glass, made his guess, sent a runner with the range, then watched the mirror above him spill the same estimate toward command. The chain worked because every man on it understood that doubt kills at a relay. If a letter was lost to Shimmer, the station stopped and asked for it again. On the same day, troop dispositions thickened. Cavalry companies spread like a comb's teeth across Arizona and New Mexico territory, posts holding the spine while patrols swept between water and trail. Miles's staff tallied head counts and reported that the number of soldiers under orders for the chase had climbed into the low thousands. He gave captains sectors bounded not by pretty lines on a map, but by the water sources that kept men and mounts alive. A lieutenant knew he owned a string of springs, a set of seeps, and a reach of the San Pedro, not abstract acres. He learned the taste of each waterhole. He learned the sound of the wind there at night, because wind that shifts wrong can carry a camp's smell far. Supply caught up to the program. Heliograph men ate on schedule because an operator who shakes from hunger drops code groups. Farriers hammered until sparks jumped under the forge in the afternoon, because remounts were the hinge on which every mile swung. The department counted shoes left in drawers and ordered iron run hot across the line in loads guarded by details who had no patience for skimming. Grain moved to drag points along routes that columns would use when the mirrors blinked new orders. At small corrals on the flats, men touched flanks and studied ears to judge which animals would stand long days without quitting. A mule with a mean eye and sound feet made the cut. A pretty horse with thin soles did not. The first week saw line tests at dawn and at mid-afternoon when air steadies. Operators logged everything. They measured how heat haze smears a distant flash at midday and how fast the fall wind strips a message to fragments after sunset. They learned to shade a mirror with a hat brim for a breath to keep the vein of light from wandering. They noted that smoke plumes from cook fires along the San Pedro drift by mid-morning and can blind a station if the tripod sits too low on slope. They set guy lines to hold a leg when ground is slick after a storm. They figured out where to stack stones for a knee-high windbreak that would not turn into a silhouette a rifleman could use. Messages shifted from tests to work. A patrol near the Babokamari sent that a small party had crossed upstream before first light. A ridge 2 stations away flashed the report and added a bearing taken from a low dust streak. A farther station blinked the likely aim of the cutters, a known seep tucked into a mesquite draw. The closest troop commander read the blinks, nodded once, and turned his skirmishers 2 points east without pausing to argue. By evening, that detail saw a fresh sign on the exact ground named by the code. No fight came of it that night, but the lesson landed. The mirrors had turned hours into minutes and forced men whose boots had already gone soft with sweat to change direction on command. None of the operators romanticized the work. They learned the cost of glare that bounces off late snow on the high flanks of the Pinaleños. They learned to read with one eye closed when the sun fell wrong. They learned to pull a tarred canvas over a station in a squall and wait for light to return rather than send garbage that would get someone thrown into the wrong canyon at dusk. They learned that messages coming up from a line of skirmishers often carried words a clerk would not write. An officer cut those before sending the report on because the point of a blink is to move facts, not tempers. Soldiers on the other end of those blinks built a habit of marching to water points named by mile count and rock type. A sergeant could tell new men that the seep in the shallow slot under twin junipers gives a slow trickle by mid-afternoon but runs clear by midnight. He could tell them to keep boots off the soft lip because one heavy step collapses the pocket and loses a night's water. He could tell them to post a rifle at the break in the wall where a man with a bow might use silence to thin a line, and to lay a picket line for horses in a shape that keeps one spook from running the whole string. The habit kept units intact when orders came at odd hours. In mid-July, a heliograph station above the upper San Pedro blinked a long report that filled 2 pages of the message book. A dust column had appeared where none should be, then split, then thinned into 3 pale threads that held to hard ground. The operator framed each block of code slowly because haze bounced the glints between eddies of heat. A station farther west asked for repeats 3 times rather than guess, then fought heat shimmer with short strokes and careful timing to push the words through. By late afternoon, the report reached a captain on the north flank of the dragoons. He shifted 2 troops without waiting for an escort, marched them dry into the teeth of a hot wind, and reached a pinch of ground at dusk that pinched tighter because the mirrors had pointed to it. The party they hoped to cut never showed. The troops slept on their carbines and drank warm water by cupfuls. The captain did not complain. The men at the stations had done their part. The band in the hills saw flashes and drew conclusions. Geronimo had no need to understand the code to read the shape of the net. White light blinked at noon from two peaks that had sat quiet a month before. Another spark answered far to the northeast. Scouts in the Chiricahua band said the station stood on ridges with long views and easy fields of fire. They said riders went to and from them with guard details too heavy for simple courier duty. They said the United States was prepared to spend daylight to compress space. The band adjusted. It moved more at night, chose washes that hide sign, and used wind to strip tracks by morning. It watered at odd hours, then left false marks under stars to pull pursuers toward dead ground. Heliograph men adjusted back. Some stations posted outlying listeners on quiet points not to signal, but to watch for the faintest stir of dust, then to run messages by hand to the instrument so the first blinks would carry weight. Signal officers rotated operators between hard posts, so no one sat too long on a needle ridge and went dull. They taught every assistant to run the key because sickness on a station cannot shut a link. They issued spare code cards because all it takes is one gust to send paper off a cliff and leave a crew staring at a mirror with no words to send. The number that mattered most was the weight of the entire force now in the field. Command counted the columns, escorts, station guards, depot crews, and the posts stripped to feed the chase. The head count pushed into the thousands, a number that meant any point on the line could be reinforced by men who understood the ground they had to cross to get there. This was not a wall. It was a net cast and drawn in, then cast again. A net has gaps. Men fell through gaps. The mirrors narrowed them. In late July, a storm rolled off the high country and buried the eastern stations in cloud and rain. Operators closed shutters and sat under canvas with blankets pulled to their necks while water turned dry arroyos into slot rivers. For 2 days, light died, and with it the net's speed. Patrols went to ground where they could. Horses stood with heads down and tails tucked, the way they always do when a storm lays into a column without warning. The system held because it had redundancy. Runners used low breaks in the weather to move written relays. Telegraph lines far down on the flats carried word to depots and posts. When the sky cleared, the crews pulled tarps, wiped glass, rechecked alignment, and threw light down the line as if the rain had been a bad dream. August turned the air sharp by dawn and cruel by mid-afternoon. On a morning with a hard blue sky, a heliograph near the southern end of the chain sighted a distant movement on a known line toward a seep used by anyone who hopes to cross a thirsty stretch. The station sent a short report with the speed of a man who has sent the same hand counts 100 times. 2 stations relayed without error. A troop commander changed course by 1.5 points. He reached the ground a little before noon, found prints not 4 hours old, and pushed on. There was no fight. There was fatigue and a tightening sense that the country was getting smaller for the hunted party. The troops slept along a ridge with saddles under heads and carbines under hands. The mirrors above them went dark as the sun died, then cold, then mute until the next day's light. Not every station sat on a named peak. Some stood on humbler ridges that offered just enough line of sight to bridge a gap. These were the posts raiders looked to knock out. Guards built stone rings and set pickets like clock teeth around the base. They stacked water and hard bread inside the circle so an operator could hold out when a small party tried to stalk the light and end it with a close shot. Nothing large hit a station that summer. A few shots snapped over a post in late afternoon when a man's eyes are most likely to make a mistake. The crews answered by shifting position a little on the same ridge to deny a second try, and by posting an extra pair on the downwind side where sound drifts before a shape shows. The system's reach went east into New Mexico, where peaks toward the Black Range and long shoulders near the Mimbres country took glass. The ties across that border mattered because captains out there watched a different set of ranches and trails. Men who had been chasing since winter rode with a new certainty that a column moving far to their right would not blunder into their path and spoil a chance. They also rode with the knowledge that if they tired a horse at noon, there would be no miracle at dusk. The mirror would call them someplace else by name, and they would have to answer. Everything the net did rested on the simplest measures held tight. Operators kept cloth covers over glass when not in use. They tucked small pebbles under feet of their tripods to kill a sway that the eye cannot see until a letter goes wrong. They cut brush to stop dust eddies from rising and smearing light. They learned to use a thumb's width held at arm's length to bracket a station on a far ridge when haze made the vein shimmer. They logged each send and receipt and wrote weather on the same line because the men who came after them would need those notes more than any praise. In the command tents and adobe rooms that passed for offices, the message books filled. Names of draws and peaks repeated across days as small reports knitted themselves into patterns. Miles's staff mapped those patterns with colored pencils. One color marked sightings that proved nothing by themselves. Another marked crossings that paired with water. A third marked the points where a small party had been tracked without a fight. The mass of it told a simple truth. The space inside the chase had shrunk. A band that once slipped between patrols at will now found men waiting at water in the morning and again at night. The pressure showed in odd places. A rancher in the Sulphur Springs Valley counted cattle twice in a week and found fewer missing than in any month that year. A stage company ran a coach on a schedule that had been cut in spring, not because the roads were safe, but because the stations could pass a warning when riders were sighted near a vulnerable stretch. A telegraph operator in Benson tapped a priority clear for an Army dispatch headed south without grumbling because he had seen a lieutenant hand over coin on time for a small favor last month. These were not victories to write on a flag. They were the slow settling of a system that both served the chase and taught men to trust it. The band made its own system. Scouts lay flat near ridges and watched stations to learn the habit of the light. When mirrors on two peaks blinked at one another without cease for a quarter hour, the watchers guessed that a large message had spilled. When stations sat quiet on clear days, at the wrong hour, the watchers guessed that a crew had been pulled to repair a line or to hunt water. And they moved through that segment faster. They learned to pick routes that put a ridge between them and the strongest stations until they had to break into open. They taught children to walk in footprints and to step on rock when they could. They taught girls to tie skirts up for silent climbs and boys to keep pots from knocking against a mule's ribs. Every lesson took the shape of survival. By late August, the files of reports told a story of relentless small moves. A troop receiving a midday blink changed course and reached a dry wash in time to find a cooking pit still warm. A station on a bald shoulder above the San Simon flashed a warning that two riders had cut across a saddle toward a deep draw. A lieutenant with sore eyes and a coffee stomach read it and rode until his legs went numb to put his men where the draw opened. They saw nothing that day but a hawk and a pair of foxes that took no notice of them. They slept where they lay and woke to read another blink that sent them the other way. The system used them like pieces on a board. They let it, because the other choice was to ride blind. The number of stations in service rose across the weeks. Each time a new peak came alive, an operator somewhere else noted that the relay time between his ridge and a far post had shed heartbeats. The chain had redundancies now. Lose one leg to weather or a cracked frame, and a message took another path with only a small cost in time. Lose two, and the system still spoke. The men who built it took no bow for that. They packed their kits when the sun slid and slept with their boots near where their hands would land, because a dawn alarm on a ridge gives no time for hunting leather in the dark. The chase did not turn into a parade. The band was too thin, too cunning, too used to hunger and distance to be caught by spectacle. The mirrors were not spectacle. They were a tool that shaved options day by day. The force that rode under their eye did not need to close a ring in a week. It needed to pull a circle tighter without breathing hard. When a station called a captain by name and told him where to put his men before first light, he did not ask who planned the move. He trusted the light. When a crew on a peak saw a dust thread slip in a place that had not held anything larger than antelope all summer, they did not argue about whether it was worth the blinks. They sent it. When a patrol shifted water plans by an hour and a half because the mirrors said to do it, no one muttered about lost sleep. By the last days of August, the network had become a fact like weather. Men cursed it when a misread letter sent them across bad footing. They praised it with a grunt when a warning saved an animal at a tricky descent. Operators cursed wind that played the mirror and smiled without show when a distant station answered on the first call. Command drew lines between points that had not held lines in spring. The number that first seemed a boast, 5,000 soldiers under orders, now had shape in the field as files moving on named ground for named reasons. The rolls of code pages from that month curled in their tins as summer eased toward the hard light of early fall. They recorded the weight of many small choices. A crew that lifted a mirror and held its breath through shimmer to keep a sentence sharp. A captain who shifted a file at noon and took the heat without losing temper. A troop that climbed on sore feet to take a ridge at dusk because the blinks would not let that ground go unwatched. A band that saw the blinks and still found space while it lasted. The net could not end the chase by itself. It could strip away hiding places until an emissary's voice and a pair of worn leaders had to face facts in a canyon where every word would be remembered. August 24th, 1886. Lieutenant Charles Bear Gatewood rode out of the pines with 2 Chiricahua scouts and a pair of pack animals that carried coffee, tobacco, and a few sacks of meal. The only gifts he would allow himself when the order was to speak without promising anything he could not deliver. His right arm lay stiff from an old bullet that had torn the joint at Sibaku. The sleeve pulled when he shifted the reins, and the ache reminded him to keep movement small and deliberate. The country ahead was the folded edge of the Sierra Madre, black oak and piñon on the heights, thorn and rock in the cuts, water hiding in seams where stone sweat collects. Somewhere in those folds, Geronimo and Nietzsche kept a camp that drifted like smoke. The 2 scouts, Caita and Martin, knew the rhythm of the people they sought. They named ridges in low voices and marked where a seep might hold enough for a midday halt. They told Gatewood which draws carry sound farther than a man expects and where a footfall on loose gravel echoes like iron on a table. The small party moved at a pace that let a man listen. They rode in a file that put the lieutenant just behind the lead scout so that any watcher would see Apache up front, and a single officer following, not a troop coming to seize anyone by surprise. The horses breathed hard on the climbs and blew out through their nostrils on the drops. A hawk turned above them and rode a slow circle against a washed blue sky. Lawton's main column lay days behind, its movement telegraphed across the uplands by the wink of mirrors from ridges that now held signal stations. Gatewood had asked for this ride because crowds with carbines finish talks before they start. He carried a message that was more fact than argument. Families from San Carlos and from those who had surrendered in spring had already been taken east by rail. Scouts who had enlisted on United States terms were prisoners along with the rest. The promise of a quick return to a reservation had been replaced by orders for confinement at far water that none of the older people had ever seen. He meant to say that out loud to faces, not send it through men who would turn it into the kind of rumor that poisons any meeting. They crossed a narrow saddle near midday and dropped into a basin where mesquite scattered shadow over pale dust. Caita lifted a hand, and they all stopped together. He slid off his horse and bent over a patch of ground that looked blank to any man who had not hunted this way since boyhood. He tipped his head, then pointed at a heel that had dug a little too deep where the ground felt soft, then at the damp edge where someone had scraped sand to pull water. Martin walked a circle, pushing brush with the side of his boot. He raised 2 fingers and then pressed his hand flat. 2 small fires. Coals buried well. Silence now. Gatewood nodded and spoke quietly that they would take the higher line on the left and come down along the spine, not up any throat that could take them in and keep them. In the late afternoon, they saw the first certain sign that watchers watched them back. A flash of white at a notch that could be stone or bone, then gone. No one reached for a gun. The scouts rode on as if nothing had moved. A ridge later, they cut into a narrow bench just wide enough to take a horse and a man's width beside it. The path angled into the shade and turned along a basalt wall. At the far end, a man sat on his heels with a rifle across his thighs, his face still, his eyes measuring each rider. Kaita said his name in a steady voice and added 2 others, names of kin. The watcher gave 1 blink and stood. He was young and thin, with dust in the creases at the corners of his mouth. He pointed with his chin and said that the leaders would speak after sundown. The camp lay scattered along a broken slope above a small run of water. Brush shelters huddled out of the wind. Blankets lay rolled tight against packs made from forked sticks and rawhide. The smell of mescal roast and wood smoke sat low in the draws. Women kept children back from the edge and sent the older ones to fetch water with small gourds and tin cups. The men who had been posted along the approaches drifted in without haste, rifles held casual and close. No one spoke loud. No one smiled. A dog put its head up and then flattened its ears and lay down again. Geronimo stepped into the open place first, boots quiet on the dust, hat brim pulled down enough to shade his eyes. His face showed the kind of wear that comes from months of hunger, miles, and the kind of listening that never stops. Nietzsche stood a little behind and to the left, taller. Shoulders carried square, the weight of a name settled across him without show. Other men stood at the edges where the path out could be taken if words broke and hands moved. Gatewood lifted his hat to the level of his heart, not higher, and spoke in Apache through Keita, who knew how to keep phrases tight and clean. He said he had come because the general wished to speak and because the general did not want a pile of bodies in some draw when talking could do better work. The first exchanges measured mood more than they carried content. Names were said without titles. Places were named like points on a map that everyone present could draw in dirt with a stick. The 2 scouts added a stitch here and there to make sure no undercurrent was missed. When the greetings were done, the lieutenant said the words he had come to say. The people who had come in with Crook had not been returned to a reservation. The army had put them on trains and taken them to Florida. The scouts who had carried United States rifles and had drawn pay had also been put on trains. Some were at Fort Marion, some were at Fort Pickens. If this band came in now, the men would not be shot under a flag of truce, but the power to promise where they would sleep 6 weeks from now did not sit in his hands. The blow landed without an answer at first. The men around the open place absorbed it the way fighters absorb a punch that they saw coming late. Geronimo's jaw set. Nietzsche's gaze moved to the ground for the space of a breath, then came back up as flat as before. A murmur passed along the edge as the news reached men who had cousins and sisters among the people already taken away. No one made a show. The older women nearby kept their blankets pulled close and kept eyes on their children. A young man spat once into the dust and then rubbed the spot away with the side of his foot out of habit, a small erasure that told more about control than a speech would have told. Gatewood did not press. He rested the tips of his fingers on his belt and let silence sit until it felt like a fact instead of a threat. Then he said the other piece. The country behind them had changed shape. A line of soldiers now stretched from the Santa Rita country into New Mexico. Mirrors blinked on ridges at noon. Messages went farther than a hard ride in a single breath. Columns shifted by order, not by guess. The point was not to smother men in a single ring of uniforms. The point was to give them no night of full rest. The chase had reached the place where distance no longer saved a camp that moved slow because of children and old people. He said he was not here to brag about it. He was here because he did not want to see that truth proven in the worst way. Nietzsche spoke first. He said in plain words that the march north would not be a straight road to any old home. He said that those already across had been split from their land and from the graves that keep people rooted. He asked who had written that order. He asked whether the same hand had written the order that would take any man in this camp away from his wife, or any mother away from her child. Gatewood answered as far as he could. The department commander had sent for him to make this contact and to bring the leaders in to speak. The department commander could promise safety on the road and an honest talk in the open. The department commander would not put irons on men who came in under his word. The department commander could not undo the trains that had already pulled away with families aboard. No one standing here would claim otherwise. Geronimo asked about the columns behind the lieutenant. He asked whether the men under Captain Lawton would be called off, or whether they would sit on every ridge with carbines across their chests and the habit of firing when a twig snaps wrong. He asked whether any talk that began here would be respected by every troop in the field, or whether some sergeant with bad ears would cut it short. Gatewood said that if a march toward a meeting began, riders would go out to tell the columns to give space and to keep their fingers off triggers. He said he would carry that message himself with the scouts he trusted. He said that if anyone broke that order, the man who broke it would answer to a general who did not accept excuses about echoes and nerves. They broke for a short while so that women could feed children and so that men could do the same without turning their backs on anyone. The scouts handed over coffee and tobacco. A pot went on coals and hissed. A tin cup made a small clink against a stone, and 3 heads turned at once to mark the source of the sound. The sun slid down the ridge and pulled a hard line of shadow across the camp. A child leaned into a mother's blanket and slept where she sat. Older boys stood along the outer edge and tried to look like men. After the food, talk turned practical. If the leaders agreed to move toward a meeting with the department commander, which way would they go? The Bavispe ran north and west toward ground patrolled by men who knew every seep. The old trails to the San Bernardino country could be taken in pieces and the gaps bridged under guard if no one tried to crowd anyone. Cayeta named a string of halts where families could sleep without a surprise at dawn. Martin said how many days it would take to cross from this ridge to a canyon near the line where riders from the north could approach without making a stampede. The numbers were given as days, not as any count of miles. A day is what a child can be carried without breaking a woman's back. A day is how far a man can walk and still count straight. Geronimo said he would not be separated from the people he led on the road to any meeting. Gatewood answered that no one would be split out for convenience. The column would hold families in one line and armed men in another near enough to answer, far enough to keep a nervous finger from becoming a disaster. Nietzsche said that if at any point the road turned into a trap, they would turn off and go back to the rock. Gatewood did not argue. He said that if talk failed because any side broke its word, a return to the ridges would be the least of the outcomes. He did not raise his voice when he said it. He let the plainness of it carry the weight. As dark took the last color out of the sky, the watchers along the approaches came in to eat. The men at the center stood again for a last word. Geronimo said he would sleep on it and speak in the light. Gatewood nodded and turned away at once so that no one could say he had tried to push a decision into the night. He and the scouts bedded down just outside the spread of shelters, saddles for pillows, carbines where hands could find them. The wind off the slope dropped and the air went sharp. A coyote called somewhere far down and another answered, and then silence slid back in. August 25th began cool and clear. A thin ribbon of mist lay in the low ground and the first sun drew it away. The scouts rose early and checked the horses. A woman passed with a small bundle of meat and set it down by the visitors without a word. Children moved in a cluster to fetch water. Men stood where they could see both the open place and the path out. When the leaders stepped forward, no one else moved. Geronimo spoke first. He said the people were tired and that they were not blind to what had changed. He said they could not outwalk the lines forever and carry the old and the small without losing those they loved along the way. He said that if the general truly meant to meet in the open with all eyes able to see every move, then they would go to that place. He set one condition that mattered more than any other. No soldiers would rush close at the last moment and turn talk into a chase. The meeting would occur where women could sit and listen and where children could feel the ground under their feet without feeling it fly under them. Gatewood said he would ride ahead with Kaita and Martine and carry that exact term. He would name the place and the hour as agreed among the leaders and the department commander. He would make sure that the path between here and there stayed open enough to keep men from panicking into a fight. He would not try to strip men of rifles on the road. He would not count cartridges as if he meant to seize them. He would look any officer in the eye who tried to crowd the column and tell him to back away. He said he would do that because the word given in this camp required it. He did not attempt an oath beyond that. The truth did not need theater. Nietzsche asked who would stand as witness if later someone in blue said different words had been spoken. Gatewood pointed at the scouts who had lived on both sides of this line long enough to know the cost of every wrong turn. He said their mouths would carry the same sentences to any command tent on the trail, and to the center of any circle in a canyon where the final talk took place. He held out a folded paper that bore the department commander's acknowledgement of their work as scouts, not as a promise of immunity, but as a sign that the general knew their names and valued their presence here. The men took the paper and did not unfold it. The weight of it in the hand was enough. They fixed a point to aim for that lay in the rough country north and a little east. A day's march for families moving tight and careful. The lieutenant would ride away in the first hour with the scouts to open the road. The camp would break down after that and move by sections so no one bottleneck could trap them. If they saw dust where no dust should be, they would stop and send a man to the edge to look. If they heard shots from any flank that did not come from a hunter's single crack, they would turn back to stone and wait for word. The lines were drawn in sentences that a child could repeat. When the talk closed, men began to act as if the decision had already built itself into the muscles. Women tied packs with the same neat knots they had tied 100 times since Turkey Creek. Boys rolled extra rawhide thongs and pushed them into side pockets. A girl folded a blanket just so and slid it under a rope so it would not chafe a pony's flank. The watchers went back to their places as a form, not because they expected treachery in the next few breaths, but because habit is what keeps a line intact when nerves begin to sing. Gatewood turned his horse downslope with Kaita and Martine on either side and took the path out along the bench they had used to enter. He did not look back. He did not want anyone reading doubt in a man's eyes who knew what lay ahead of him. Once clear of the camp, the three men picked up pace. They moved in a straight, unshowy line, cutting sign that anyone could read on purpose so that no over-eager party would take them for decoys and shoot into them by mistake. At the first rise, where a heliograph station could be reached by sight, If a relay crew had already pushed a glass into place, the scouts raised a blanket on a stick and dropped it 3 times to mark a friendly party moving with a name to speak. The ridge answered with a small glint that said the station was manned and awake. The message Gatewood sent by mirror and by rider said what had to be said and nothing more. The leaders would move toward a meeting place that would be named shortly. Columns nearest the line of march would keep off enough to let people breathe. No one would swing a troop into a slot canyon ahead of the families. Water would be left alone at agreed halts. Any courier riding from those families toward command would pass without challenge. Any captain who needed to see with his own eyes would sit his horse at a distance and do his seeing without breaking the crust of the column's calm. Martin took the first long run toward where Lawton waited with his camp set out of view of the route. Kaita angled toward a lower ridge to watch for any movement from the west that could clip the path. Gatewood held center and rode as if measuring each mile with a gauge only he could see. He carried in his head the sentences spoken in the shaded open place and the expressions that had come and gone when he said Florida out loud. He knew that the next days would hold crowding and second thoughts and the chafe of people who have every reason to mistrust men in uniform. He also knew that the weight of the chase had bent the arc toward an end that talk could now make less bloody. Behind him, the Chiricahua camp began to flow off the slope. Children walked where they were told. Women kept pace without leaving anyone behind. Men ranged at the edges with eyes that worked like a clock. They stepped through light that shifted from thin to thick as clouds moved across the high country and back again. They did not call this a march toward surrender when they spoke to one another. They called it a march toward a meeting where outcomes would be set in sentences that could be remembered and repeated. The difference mattered when a man put one foot in front of another and told himself why he did it. By late afternoon, riders from Lawton's command had reached the first relay point and turned their mounts to hold a line that would not fray. They were told to keep their carbines in scabbards and their mouths shut unless spoken to. They were told to water behind the families, not in front of them, and to leave a guard at each seep that would answer to Gatewood first. Then to any officer who showed a written order that matched the words the lieutenant had sent by glass and by hand. They did as told. They had ridden long in this summer and knew the shape of a thin chance when they saw one. The sun fell and threw gold into the cuts. The first halt on the road stood close now. A shallow basin with enough brush to break wind and enough room to keep animals from trampling children. Gatewood rode on into the dim to fix the next day's relay, the scouts hard against his stirrups. The camp behind him wound in like a rope being coiled, each turn touching the last without crossing it. Night took the color out of everything until only movement and shape remained. Men laid down with rifles where hands could close around wood and iron. Women wrapped children tight and listened for the noises that tell whether a camp is holding together or fraying. The day had changed a war by the width of a hand. A small party had found a larger one without a shot. Words had set a road instead of the sound of rifles deciding it. The mirrors on the ridges would talk again at first light. Riders would carry breath to tents and adobe rooms where officers would write the next distances and the next halts. The men and women on the slope would test each detail with their eyes and their feet. The choice to move toward a named canyon had not ended the ground truth that had driven every mile since Turkey Creek. It had put that truth inside appointments that could be kept or broken, and every man on both sides understood what that meant. September 3rd, 1886. Heat lay along the Pelonchillo Mountains like a hand on the back of the neck, and the mouth of Skeleton Canyon held still air that made breath taste of chalk. Riders from General Nelson A. Miles's advance elements had taken positions across the lower folds at first light. Not in a tight ring that invites panic, but in staggered lines that showed weight without pushing it. Scouts stood in pairs at the ridges that looked down on the dry wash. Farther out, Heliograph stations were already blinking short checks to posts that watched the San Simon and the San Bernardino corridors. The canyon's floor was pale with baked gravel. Mesquite threw hard shadows in tight circles. Every sound carried. Gatewood came in early with Kaita and Martine moving at a measured walk, reins loose, hands away from gun butts. Behind them, along a line that kept dust low, came a small escort whose orders were simple: keep eyes out and mouths closed. Gatewood had spent the last days walking a line between men who sleep with rifles as a habit and men who command those rifles by written order. He had marked halts between dry rock and stingy seeps, and had explained each one to couriers from both sides so no surprise would ruin an appointment mile by mile the path had held. This canyon was the first place chosen where the ground itself did not favor a sudden breakaway. Across from the pickets, the column of Chiricahua families and fighters began to appear from the eastern reaches, not all at once but in pieces that could be counted, then counted again. Women came on foot beside ponies that carried what could not be left behind: rolled blankets, folded hides, mescal knives, small pots, the rawhide frames that hold packs against the sway of an animal's ribs. Children walked close to legs they trusted and did not run. Men watched the rims and the shallow saddles with faces that showed nothing and eyes that saw everything. No songs, no beads, no display. Only the careful, deliberate movement of a people who had been chased until sleep and food came as brief loans instead of rights. Miles kept the main mass of his troops back out of the canyon's throat. He rode down with a limited staff and a file of Apache scouts whose presence told its own blunt truth, that men who know the country now stood under his orders and would carry any message he sent. He sat his horse still and let those around him absorb that he wore field clothes and a hard expression instead of any sashed uniform meant for show. The first minutes were about sight and spacing, not words. Everyone measured everyone else in the silent arithmetic of distance, angle, and the time it would take to clear leather if the world turned bad. When the first exchange happened, it was held in a bare patch no larger than a room floor. Gatewood spoke the introductions in Apache, every name marked so that there would be no mistake later about who had stood in which place. Geronimo stepped forward, a thin hardness in his cheeks and an old fatigue in the set of his shoulders. Nietzsche stood half a horse length to his side, taller, jaw tight. The men who had ridden the edges of the column formed a loose crescent behind them, rifles carried low. Miles nodded once. Not a bow, not an invitation, a simple acknowledgement that this was the center of gravity for the day. The first sentence from Miles was not a flourish. It was a term. The fighting would stop at once. No shots from the rim, no raids away from the canyon, no delays that lead to night chases and bodies left in cuts. Men who came into the open would not be fired on. The column that had reached this choke in the hills would not be split for convenience on the road. He did not promise ease. He promised control and custody. The people here would be treated as prisoners of war. They would not be put against a wall and shot. They would be transported east by rail under guard. Their lives would be held under military authority, not under a lynch crowd or some local whim. The words hit like stones dropped into a dry well. They made sound, then echoes. Geronimo asked where east meant. He asked whether families would remain together in the cars and at the posts where they would be confined. He asked whether the men who had carried United States cartridges as scouts would be allowed to stand aside and rejoin their wives and children without irons. He asked whether a paper would be written in the open that said exactly what mouth had spoken. He had heard too many promises uttered in canyons and undone in offices. Miles fixed each question in order. East meant military posts in Florida at the outset. The War Department had determined that confinement there would keep the peace in Arizona and New Mexico and stop the small wars that break out when a handful of raiders runs a ranching valley wild. He said that no executions would follow this surrender, that the army would guard the column from the canyon to the rail, from the rail to the posts, and inside the posts after arrival. He said he would not hand anyone over to a civilian mob at any siding along the tracks. He did not name a date for release. He did not write a number of months on the air. He did not say a reservation in Arizona would take the people back after a little time. He stayed with what the command he held could actually do. Gatewood added the ground rules already carried word by word along the trail. The meeting would be conducted within plain sight of the families. No soldiers would make a last-minute move that looked like a rush. Any stacking of weapons would be done where hands could still reach them until the paper was signed. Any separating of men from their horses would happen when orders were given for movement, not at this first talk. If a courier came into the open from the Chiricahua side, he would pass and return without challenge. He pointed toward the lower wash and set the boundary line in a sentence that no blue coat would ride past that mesquite until the last word had been said. The heat stood without mercy. Dust rose from every footfall and hung at knee height. The canyon walls reflected glare that made eyes water. Scouts handling the heliograph on a shoulder to the west blinked short notes to the rear. Station ready. Meeting underway. No shots. Hold columns at present distance. Near the wash, a surgeon took careful shade measurements as if it were any other day, because when men have marched this long, dehydration and nervous fevers kill quietly. The routine of the machine did not slow to accommodate the drama of the moment. It tightened around it so that the moment would not collapse into confusion. Nietzsche spoke next, voice steady, cadence even, words chosen for clarity rather than force. He said the people were here because there were no more safe miles left between the lines, that thin water and long chases had broken the idea of a permanent camp in the mountains, that every halt for the old and the very young had been paid for in risk. He said their coming into the open did not erase wrongs done before, arrests under flags, separations at posts, trains taken east when ranchers expected to see men driven back to San Carlos. He asked whether the guard on this new road would be firm enough to prevent drunken settlers from settling old claims with a rifle at a siding. Miles answered that the guard would be strong, that the rail officers had already been given instructions, that the first cars would not stop to feed the curious. His face did not soften. He did not speak as a supplicant. He spoke as an officer writing a detailed order in the air. The men in the crescent behind the leaders shifted weight from one leg to the other in the way fighters do when standing still starts to take more strength than walking. The rifles stayed down. A boy near the animals coughed twice and then bit his lip to keep quiet. A woman shifted a baby from one hip to the other and watched the meeting without blinking. A mule laid its ears back and went still when a fly landed on the corner of its eye. Everything in the place had been reduced to words, breath, and a canvas of silence stretched tight across rocks and scrub. Miles laid out movement and numbers. The families would be escorted to a railhead under a guard that included officers who knew the language and scouts whose orders were clear. The armed men would be supervised along a parallel track, not run into a single crowded knot that could turn into a panic. Every man would be counted at the canyon, at the first night halt, at the second, and again at the rail. The count would include the old, the injured, and the smallest children. Because lost children generate rumors that outpace trains, and rumors turn into disasters when men with rifles imagine kidnappings where none have happened. Food would be issued as ration, not as gifts that chiefs had to fight each other for. Water would be guarded by mixed details so no one could say that one side had been allowed to cut the other off. If a man tried to run, he would be called back once, then seized and bound, not shot out of hand. That last sentence weighed as much as any other thing he said. Geronimo did not interrupt. He listened like a man whose nights had been spent adding and subtracting small certainties. When Miles's voice stopped, he asked what would happen to the scouts who had come as envoys. He pointed at Cayeta and Martine without turning his head toward them. Miles said they would not be punished for carrying messages under orders. He said the same in Apache through Gatewood, not because he doubted that the meaning carried, but because the weight of hearing it twice, and in two voices, strengthens the bond of a promise made in a canyon. A pause spread. The canyon noise shrank to the tinnitus that comes when nerves have been stretched for hours. One of Miles's aides shifted his mount's feet a little and set them again. The heliograph on the ridge cut a few short blinks to an answering shoulder. A breeze came through and dried sweat lines on cheeks and necks. It carried the smell of dust and hot stone. In that beat, Geronimo made the turn. He said in a voice that could be heard from the pickets to the family column that he would meet the general on the same ground the next day and finish what had been started. He named the hour. He said no shot would be fired by his people in the night. He told his men to hold the line where they stood and not to test the edges. He set his own order in front of all eyes so there would be no misunderstanding about who held sway among his fighters. Miles answered that he would return at the hour named, that the guard would remain where it stood through the dark, that any officer who broke that posture would pay for it, and that any civilian seen moving into the canyon without orders would be turned back. He turned his horse a half-pace and looked up toward the ridge where the glass sat. The station responded with a single wink as if saluting the turn of the day. The aides took the cue and backed their animals a step to let space open without confusion. Gatewood stepped aside and let the leaders pass within arm's reach of each other without touching a hand to a hand, without any sign that could be misread by someone with nerves already tied in knots. The rest of the day settled into the practical acts that make a vow possible the next morning. Miles's quartermaster sent for additional barley and hard bread because a column fed is a column steadied. A medical officer set basins at a small spring out of sight and instructed the guard that women and children would go first and alone, that men in blue would stand back where their shadows would not cross the water. Teamsters took their wagons out to the flanks and raised canvas without showing a line that could be mistaken for a barricade. Sentries were posted in pairs with orders written short, enough that a man could repeat them at dawn after half a night awake and not drop a clause. On the Chiricahua side, men showed that they understood exactly how thin the margin was. Watchers posted on the low shelves kept eyes on cavalry files and looked away only to wipe sweat with knuckles. Women stacked packs so they could be lifted in one movement when the time came. A boy repaired a rawhide strap by rolling it between his palms to soften it, then pulling a knot down until it set with a small pop. A girl folded a blanket with the dexterity of someone who had done the same thing in wind and rain and dark, then slid it under the belly rope where it would not rub hair off a pony's rib. Evening bled light out of the canyon and turned the open place into a deeper shade. Gatewood walked the line of pickets and found the edges held by men who understood that nothing ruins a negotiated road faster than a nervous trigger. He spoke to each one and made every order a sentence that a man could hold in his head without repeating it twice. Miles walked the line once as well, not to be recognized, but to have seen with his own eyes that the space would hold through the night. When he rode back to his camp a short distance down the wash, the staff around him understood that the day had banked the fire without letting it go cold. Night in Skeleton Canyon came without wind. Fires were small and low on both sides and were hidden in turns where their light would not play across rifle barrels or throw dancing shadows that could be taken for movement. Men lay down with saddles under their necks and carbines laid along thighs. A small child whimpered once and then slept hard against a mother's side, A coyote called twice from a distance and got no answer from anything human. Above, the heliograph posts were silhouettes and nothing more. The glass packed away, the tripods laid down, crews rolled in blankets with their boots within reach of hands. Wires far off carried small words to posts that never quite sleep. Nothing grand, only the kind of updates that keep a machine ready to move at first light. Past midnight, a horse in the Chiricahua column snorted and stamped at a dream only horses see. A sentry on the United States side shifted his weight and exhaled through his nose to let his body ease without lifting a boot. A lieutenant checked his watch by feel and then did not strike a match because a stray glow can drive unkind thoughts into the head of a tired man with a rifle. The canyon held. By the last hour before dawn, the air cooled enough to make breath a little visible. Thin mist formed in the lowest folds, then went away when the first color touched the eastern edge. Men woke quietly and rose with method, not in a rush. The day set to carry the next step was already in motion. The terms had been said out loud, in the open, under the weight of many eyes. They had been framed in distances and acts that could be measured. No one there mistook what had been promised for anything kinder than custody. No one misread custody as a thing without teeth. The scale of the hunt stood all around the canyon, as plain as the rock faces and the dry mesquite roots. Columns on the ridges, mirrors on the shoulders, wire stations sending short commands into rooms stacked with ledgers and maps. The people who had come into the open saw it and accepted that they had reached a line that could not be pushed back with legs, only crossed with words. The last small details mattered. A teamster oiled a squeaking wheel because a sudden shriek at the wrong moment can sound like the start of a charge. A surgeon tested the stopper of a water keg so it would not rattle on the road. A scout checked the lashings on a mule that would carry extra blankets for the youngest. Miles wrote a few lines in a small book with a pencil and tore the page free for his adjutant. A time, a place to stand, a reminder that each count at each halt would be read aloud so the numbers would live in more than one man's head. He put the pencil back and closed the book with a thumb and forefinger as if pinching a hot coal. Geronimo sat on his heels for a few quiet breaths, then stood and pulled his blanket across his shoulders. He looked once at the rim line and once at the shallow bend in the wash. He did not look at Gatewood or Miles in that moment. He looked at the column of his own people and at the narrow cut through which they would pass. Nietzsche stepped up beside him with the economy of a man who has nothing to add and everything to do. Their faces said what the day would make them say out loud in its first hour. They would finish the terms in the open where everyone could hear them. They would take the road that followed. They would hold themselves and their people together through the railhead and into a future none of them would choose if choice still existed. The canyon received that decision the way rock receives sun, without change but with consequence. It would be spoken again when the hands of the officers and the hands of the fighters shaped the next set of acts. When rifles passed into stacked order, when horses were turned and led, when the first step carried the column toward the rail. The long summer of messages and marches had drawn all of them to this bare piece of ground. The work of a net, of glass and code, of patrols and counts, of rations and remounts, lay under the surface of the single word that mattered now. September 4th, 1886. Sun cleared the Pelanchillo crest with hard light and no wind. Pickets on both rims called their short checks and settled to watch hands, horses, and distance. The lower wash of Skeleton Canyon lay chalk-colored and dry. Men of the guard detail stood off in staggered files where they could be seen without looking like a wall. Apache scouts held the mouths of 2 shallow draws and kept their weapons low. A surgeon unpacked basins near a damp spot under mesquite and waited for orders that would bring women and children first. Gatewood rode in with Kaita and Martine at a slow walk, reins slack, faces steady. Geronimo and Nietzsche stepped out from their column without ceremony and stood on packed gravel where the ground did not give under heels. General Nelson A. Miles came forward with a small staff, compact in the saddle, hat brim cutting glare. No one reached for a hand. Each man spoke in a voice that would carry only as far as it needed to. Miles repeated the terms so that no one would mistake what came next. The fighting stopped here. The people in this canyon would be taken into military custody, counted at each halt, guarded to the rail, and sent east. No executions, no handoff to civilians, no promise of return to Arizona. Food and water under ration, movement under order. Geronimo asked where families would sleep until the train stood ready. He asked who would ride between the lines to keep frightened settlers out of the road. He asked whether scouts who had carried messages would be allowed to stay with their own people. Miles set short answers in place. Families would bivouac under guard near the first water north. Column riders would hold the flanks and the road mouth. Envoys would not be seized for the work they had done. Kaita and Martine heard those words twice, once in English, once in Apache, and nodded once without speaking. Gatewood gave the mechanics. Weapons would be laid out in rows where everyone could see them, not piled in a knot. Ammunition belts would be set beside the weapons. Horses would be led to a separate rope line, then returned to riders when the escort formed. Men would keep blankets and necessary gear. Packs for women and children would not be opened except to move a dangerous object to the weapon line. Counts would be read aloud at each step: rifles, revolvers, cartridges, mounts, men, women, children, old ones, infants. Any correction to a count would be made in front of both sides. Nietzsche turned to his men and gave the order. The crescent behind him broke into measured movement. Rifles came forward butt first and were lowered onto gravel with muzzles pointed away from the circle of families. Revolvers were drawn, unloaded, and laid grip to grip by twos. Belts came off and were coiled tight with buckles turned inward. A boy carried a short carbine that had been cut down for a smaller body. He placed it at the end of a row and stepped back without looking left or right. A man with a scar across his scalp slid cartridges from his mouth into his palm and set them with the rest. The sound in the canyon turned into the small scrape of metal on stone and the dry whisper of leather on dust. Miles's ordnance sergeant moved along the rows, counting in a flat tone. A clerk walked behind with a notebook and a hard pencil that squeaked on each digit. Another soldier set each tally against the name lists already built from weeks of reports. No one hurried the math. The numbers had to live clean in more than one head. Apache scouts stood just far enough away to keep the space from tightening and watched the edges where a mistake can start. The heliograph on the shoulder west of the wash sent a brief update to the rear. Meeting concluded, arms stacking underway, column stable. Women eased forward when Gatewood pointed at the spring. Two at a time stepped into the shade, filled small gourds and cups, and carried them back to children who had stood with their hands clenched to keep from running. A girl lifted a tin ladle to an older woman whose lips cracked when she swallowed. A boy stared at the rows of rifles and then looked at his mother's face. She touched his shoulder and kept her gaze on the ground. The animal line formed with quiet hands. Rawhide hitches were retied, lead ropes checked, sore spots under blankets lifted and looked at with the practiced touch of people who count miles in their fingers. A mule flattened its ears and threatened to bite. A scout stepped close, turned its head, and held the jaw until the rope settled. A corral crew from the escort laid out picket pins in a pattern that would keep one spook from running the whole string, then backed away and left space. Miles called for the first formal count. The clerk read it aloud: rifles by specific number, revolvers, belts, cartridges, mounts. He read the count of men, then women, then children, then the aged, then infants. each set in words, no figures on the air to be mistranscribed later. Gatewood repeated the totals in Apache. Naiche added the names of 2 boys who had been carried when the first line moved and would be counted as children, not as burdens that someone might ignore. The clerk nodded, set a bracket in his book, and drew a line under the tallies. The escort formed by sections, not as a single tight cord. Apache scouts took the outer arc on both flanks. A troop of cavalry stood off to the north with carbines slung and reins short. A small rear guard held the washmouth farthest from the railroad. Teamsters brought 2 wagons close enough to carry the frailest without shoving wheels into the family line. The surgeon sent his assistant to each wagon with a small bag and instructions to keep eyes on heat and on children who had slept too little and eaten too little for too long. Geronimo looked once at the stacked rows of iron, then at the column of his people. He stepped to the head of the family line and put his hand flat on the neck of a small bay that had carried a child for days. He did not speak. He set his body where others could see it. Naiche stood to his right where the road narrowed, shoulders square, eyes on the first bend. Gatewood took position where both leaders could see him and where he could hear any order from Miles without turning his back on the people in motion. Miles nodded to his adjutant. The adjutant raised his hand and dropped it. The head of the column moved. The sound was leather, hooves on grit, the soft rattle of cup against cup where a woman had not had time to pad tin with cloth. No bugle sounded, no cheer rose. The canyon air kept its weight. The stacked rifles lay on the gravel like a record and a warning. 2 ordnance men remained to guard the stacks until wagons could bring crates to lift the iron away under seal. The first halt lay at a low basin north of the canyon mouth, a place chosen for thin shade, a trickle of water, and enough room to keep lines straight. The escort set a loose ring. Scouts on the flanks found small rises where they could see and be seen. The quartermaster issued meal, coffee, and a measured cut of beef. The women worked fast with what they were given, no wasted motion, no smoke that would carry. The surgeon made his rounds with steady eyes and a quiet voice, checking tongues and pulses, handing a tin cup to a boy who had locked his jaw against thirst because he had been told not to ask. At the halt, officers ran the second count. The clerk read totals again. Gatewood repeated them. A man stepped forward to say that 1 cartridge belt in the stack had been tied with 2 extra loops that held a few rounds under the main coil. The ordnance sergeant went to the rows, opened the coil, pulled the loops, and laid the rounds with the rest. He spoke the revised number, and the clerk set it down. That small correction closed a hole that rumor might have widened on the rail platform 2 nights later. In the afternoon, the column rose and moved again toward the low corridor that led to Fort Bowie and the nearest railhead. Dust lifted from the feet of the animals and hung above the gravel like breath. The escort kept its spacing. No rider rushed the family line. The only orders heard were distance, pace, water, and halt. The heliograph posts along the route blinked short relays that moved faster than any galloper. Road clear, no contact on flanks, schedule holding, first issue complete. Geronimo walked portions on foot to ease a small mare ridden by a child whose knees hugged the blanket to keep from sliding. Naiche checked the lashings on a rawhide frame that carried a rolled bed for an old man whose legs had failed 2 days before. A woman adjusted a gourd stop so it would not knock against a pony's ribs. A girl carried a small basket by the rim and kept it from swinging. These were the acts that make a movement hold together. They were done without speech. Late light found the escort easing the column into a second basin with wider space and cleaner water. The guard set posts where shadows fell. The quartermaster issued another measured ration. The surgeon ordered a small bath for 3 children under canvas so they could be cooled without drawing eyes. Miles rode the line once and spoke only to confirm that the next day's schedule matched what had been set in the canyon. He did not add weight. He did not loosen it. He kept the machine running in the shape that had been promised. That night, the rows of rifles lay in crates under seal at the canyon, guarded by a detachment that had orders in writing for any man who came close. A wagon train would lift those crates before noon the next day. At the basin, no fires burned where light could carry. Men lay with blankets over shoulders and weapons out of reach by design. Sentries counted slow in their heads to stay awake. Coyotes called far off. The air cooled enough for breath to show for a few moments before dawn. Morning brought the next leg and the third count. The clerk read the totals for men, women, children, old ones, mounts, and gear. Gatewood repeated them. A boy sneezed twice and smiled when handed a cloth dipped in cool water. A mule laid its ears back and kicked once at a fly. Apache scouts on the flank shifted watch posts as the sun moved. The escort's rear guard angled across a low cut to discourage anyone curious from following the road to stare. By midday, the first low shapes of the Bowie country came up through heat. The line held straight through the final bend. Fort Bowie's adobe and timber stood on its shelf with sentries on the parapet, and a detail already waiting at the corral. The escort split as ordered, families toward the shaded ground near the post, armed men toward a separate rope line and a level stretch where they could sit, eat, and be seen without being crowded. There was no parade. There was movement measured in acts. Miles issued the order for staging to rail. The quartermaster began assigning spots on the first train. A staff officer walked the platform at Bowie Station and wrote times, not guesses. A telegrapher cleared the wire for priority military traffic. A freight agent counted cars that would be coupled for the first lift east. The surgeon wrote the names of the very young and the very old on a scrap that he pinned to his cuff so he would not trust memory when the boarding started. Gatewood stood where the two lines could see him and kept his eyes on both. In the heat of the afternoon, a civilian wagon rattled near the edge of the road and stopped too close to the family area. Two men stood in the wagon bed and stared. An Apache scout stepped into view and said nothing. A cavalry sergeant walked to the wagon's head and took the bit. The driver looked down into a face that did not move. He clucked once, turned the team, and rolled back the way he had come, boards squeaking, harness creaking. No speech was needed. The line held. As light fell, the last work of the surrender, day settled into fact. Weapons lay sealed and guarded. People lay under blankets with rations in their stomachs and water in arm's reach. The next day's move to the platform lay written in ledgers and in men's heads. A general had set terms in the open and kept them through the first hardest hours. Two leaders had taken their people into custody rather than drag them back into rock and hunger with death waiting at the bends. An emissary had stood in the wind of both commands and held a narrow path clear long enough to bring a column from shadow into sight. Night came down without drama. The guard walked their posts in pairs. The station agent at Bowie checked his watch against the telegraph office clock and marked the first departure on a board with a stick of chalk. A far coyote called and got no answer. Somewhere in the family line, a child dreamed and moved a hand as if to hold a spoon. Somewhere in the armed line, a man lay with open eyes and breathed slow until sleep finally took his body. The surrender at Skeleton Canyon existed now as counted objects, sealed crates, marked ledgers, standing guards, and a timetable that would roll steel east the next day. The long pursuit that had started at Turkey Creek ended here as custody, inventory, and a road that ran on rails, October 25, 1886. The train brakes gripped iron and threw heat into the morning at Pensacola. Salt hung in the air beyond the depot platforms. Soldiers stepped down first, file by file, then formed two flanks that faced outward to keep the curious back from the cars. Orders moved in short sentences. Men on the platform shouldered townspeople away from the steps and cleared a lane from the coach doors to the wagons. Inside the cars, guards lifted latches and slid doors aside. Women held children by the wrists and waited for the signal. The older ones blinked at humid glare after weeks of dust. The separation had been set on paper before dawn. Geronimo and the adult fighting men would be taken across water to Fort Pickens on Santa Rosa Island and confined there under a permanent guard. Families and the rest of the Chiricahua prisoners would continue by rail across Florida to the old stone fort at St. Augustine. The language of custody read stiff on the page. The shape of it was sharper in the yard. A provost marshal read the names for the small party that would board the harbor boat. A clerk checked each name against the list he had carried from Arizona, then against the list written in Texas, then checked a third time against the count taken the night before in the last siding west of the Gulf. The men called forward stepped down to the platform and stood in a tight block, unarmed, belts turned in at the railhead days ago and sealed in crates under guard. The women and children were brought to the far side of the same platform under a separate guard so that the two lines would not crowd each other and panic. They stood with packs looped by rawhide across shoulders and small bundles of clothes tied neat at the corners. A baby stirred in a blanket and drew a small line of sweat across a mother's collarbone. Boys stared at the water glimpsed between buildings. Girls looked at the unfamiliar shape of wharf cranes and coiled dock lines. A wagon team shifted and stamped on planks that creaked under wheels loaded with crates of army hard bread, barrels of salt pork, and medical chests. Pensacola's low warehouse roofs threw flat shade onto a yard already hot enough to make breath slow. A harbor launch sat at the foot of the pier, steam rising in thin vertical threads from its stack. Sailors stood with boat hooks ready. An officer at the gangway read the hard rule again. The adult fighting men would be transported under guard to Fort Pickens. They would not be allowed to roam the wharf, they would not be allowed to speak to civilians, and they would not be allowed any delay in boarding. The small block of men moved when told, each with his hands free and each with a soldier's eyes on him from 10 feet. Boots thumped the gangway. The deck took their weight with a groan heard under the slap of bay water against pilings. Shackles were not used. They were not needed here. The cordon around the pier was a ring that did not have to be seen, to be felt. Geronimo stood near the bow at the angle where the rail opens a view forward. He did not touch the rail. His face held the same fixed economy that had carried him through the canyon and through the days of rail and stations and sidetracks. Nietzsche stood a little back, shoulders square, gaze on the line that cut the bay from the low horizon. The launch cast off. Lines thumped free. A bell rang twice. The propeller grabbed water and pushed the boat into the chop. The shore slid sideways past the men on the deck. Warehouses, cranes, shifting figures held back by guards. Then a stretch of open water that brought a different smell into the nose, thick with salt and sun-warmed rot from marsh. Behind them, the station guards turned back toward the cars because the second movement had to start at once. On the cars bound east, the conductor spoke with the provost, then with the officer in charge of the escort. Families would stay together by car. The doors between coaches would be kept open so guards could pass and count. Windows would be propped for air. Rations would be issued at the first long stop. A medical man would ride the middle coach. He would check babies first, then the very old, then anyone who looked feverish. Train hands shifted a baggage truck to clear the way. A boy carrying a small bundle of meal stumbled and caught himself on the jam. His mother took the bundle and pushed him forward with a firm hand between the shoulders. The launch ran a straight line for Santa Rosa. Fort Pickens rose from the sand at water's edge, brick and sand-hued angles and heavy walls punched with dark mouths for guns. The outer beach shone white under a sun that took color out of everything else. Soldiers stood by the seawall. A detail waited on the small landing to take lines and to move the party ashore one by one without crowding. When the boat nosed up, sailors threw loops, drew the launch in, and set the gangway. Guards placed themselves at the foot of the plank and at the top, not touching anyone, not easing the eyes they kept fixed on hands and faces. Inside the fort, the casemates gaped, deep vaulted rooms where air moved slow and stayed damp. The posts knew their routine. A sergeant read the intake order again and repeated the core of it in Apache through the interpreter who had come with the guard. The men would be counted in, assigned a casemate, issued blankets, and told the schedule. Roll call at set hours, rations issued on a posted plan. Water carried in buckets under escort, no knives allowed, no movement outside the designated yard without a guard detail. Work details assigned to keep the place clean and to carry fuel and stores. Medical checks repeated every day. An officer stood by while numbers were read and checked against the ledger. The pencil that set each mark squeaked in the still air. Geronimo watched the count without comment. The men stood in a line that filled the arch with bodies and silence. A guard unlocked a side door that led into the yard where prisoners would be allowed to walk in turns under watch. The sun there hit brick and came back at faces with force. A detail carried in buckets and set them near the door. Cups were issued in a stack from a crate and counted out by the same clerk who had counted rifles weeks ago. A corporal showed sleeping places, bare floor in the casemate arranged so that a man could lie down and stand up without stepping over another. Blankets folded into squares sat on the floor like dull flags. The men walked to their places, set bundles down, and came back to stand under the arch to wait for the next order. Across the bay, the eastbound train slid into motion, wheels threw steady metal on metal. The escort sat facing the passengers, not next to them, so that eyes stayed on hands and doors and the space where trouble starts. Ration sacks sat on a platform between seats. A child turned a tin cup over and over in small hands and set it down on the bench without spilling it. The conductor called the first stop and the cars took a curve that pulled the bay out of sight. Palmetto, pine, and low water flats replaced docks and cranes. The heat inside the cars stacked upward. Guards propped more windows with sticks. The medical man made his first pass, checked 2 infants for breath that rasped, and asked for cool cloths to be kept ready. The escort sergeant walked the intercar platforms and kept his eyes on the couplers and the doors, the things that kill men when distracted crews miss a latch. At Fort Pickens, the prisoners learned the schedule in its bare outline before noon. Roll at morning, mid-afternoon, and evening. Rations at set hours, beans, meal, salt pork in a measured cut, coffee made weak to spread, water from barrels filled and sealed. Yard time by casemate, small groups under a guard who walked the edge and watched faces and hands in the moment when a man turns his head too quick. Work details to carry fuel, to move stores, to scrub floors, to muck the gutters that run under the casemate door sills when rain drives through the place and refuses to leave until pushed. Medical checks at last light, lights out at a fixed hour, lamps trimmed by a guard so no flame stayed too close to canvas or wood. No spirits in the yard or in the rooms, no knives, no tools held longer than the task. Every rule set as a sentence a man could keep in his head and repeat under pressure. The men from the launch were shown the yard. Sand and shell crunch gave underfoot with a distinct sound that carried in the walls. A line of Gulf swells stepped in and broke beyond the outer wall with a timed thud. A gull hung in the white above and cried once, then moved on. Geronimo stood with eyes on the gap where water showed under a low stretch of sky. His face did not change. The guard at his shoulder kept the same steady distance as in the yard at Pensacola, hands free, rifle slung, attention on movement more than on the person who made it. Midday at the St. Augustine line, the train halted for water and for the first open ration issue. The escort detailed 2 men per coach to set a table of rough boards and to place meal, pork, and coffee in measure. Women moved quick. Fires were not allowed. Food was eaten as issued and washed with water from the tank. A girl lifted a cup to an older woman's mouth and kept it there until the swallow was done. A boy stood stiff with the habit of not begging and took a slice when handed to him, held it in a fist and ate without looking at anyone. The guard checked car doors and windows again, then checked the couplers, then walked the length of the train to keep eyes honest. The coastal air on Santa Rosa laid a film on everything that did not move. Clothing went damp and stayed that way until night. The smell of salt and brick dust sat in the throat. The fort's daily noise took on a pattern, sentry boots on brick in a route that could be mapped in 8 steps, 5 steps, 40 paces on a parapet, then down again. The prisoners learned the route because a man learns any pattern that defines where he lives. They learned the schedule for water buckets and for the door that opened to the yard and closed again at a spoken time. They learned which guard said his orders like facts and which added a small curl to the words without changing their meaning. They learned that sunrise came fast off water and that night dropped with less warning than it did in high country. In the casemates, the damp worked into bones. Blankets picked up smells and kept them. Men turned in place on the floor to spare hips and shoulders from brick that had cooled under shade. A medical man came with a small bag and a canvas roll of instruments and set the roll down on a box under light. He checked eyes, tongues, old wounds, and the kind of cough that has to be watched. He spoke little and wrote less, only enough to make sure the next man would know who needed a second look. A guard carried out a pail with refuse. The same guard brought in a bucket of clean water and set it down, where it would not be kicked in the dim. Back on the rails, the St. Augustine train crossed low rivers that ran broad and flat under trestles. The escort tightened and then loosened again at each siding where townspeople craned to look. At one small stop, a group of men climbed onto a platform at the far end and stared. A corporal walked down with 2 privates, said nothing, set boot heels on the edge of the platform, and waited until the locomotive took water and signaled. The civilians stepped back. The train pulled away. The escort wrote the name of the siding and the time on a slate and handed it to the officer in the middle coach so the ledger would hold the same detail at the end of the run. The arrival at St. Augustine sat at a corner of the day when sun hits Old Stone Flat. The fort stood squat and heavy above the town, a block of coquina with a dry moat and a gate that showed deep shadow. Soldiers cleared the way from the rail to the post yard. The same intake routine played again, names read, numbers read, rations staged, water staged, medical checks staged. The people moved through in groups that did not tangle. The casemates there were dry in the heat and hard in the night. The air inside smelled of old powder salt and the sweat of men who had been held there under other wars. A child pressed a palm against stone that had been cut to rough squares and pulled it back, surprised by grit on skin. Women folded blankets along walls and set small places to sit and to store what little they had left. At both posts, the guard routines settled into exact lines before dark. At Fort Pickens, roll call under the arch, then yard by casemate, then water, then back to sleeping places, then the last count with names and a single answer for each. At Fort Marion, the same cadence in a different stone. No man was allowed to walk a yard of his own without accounting for it. No woman was allowed beyond the casemate line without a set of eyes watching. The word prisoner of war moved from paper to habit. It sat on shoulders when a man lay down and when he stood up. After sunset at Fort Pickens, a gulf wind came light over the walls and made the lamp flames gutter. A guard pushed a glass chimney down over a wick to keep it steady. The sound of swells carried under the arch and into the casemate like a slow drum. Geronimo lay with a folded blanket under his head and his hands flat on his ribs. Eyes open at first, then closed. A man 2 places away coughed twice and settled. The guard at the door looked at the clock on the wall and read the time for the last check, then took the count in a low voice and marked the ledger with a blunt pencil. East in St. Augustine, the town noises reached into the casemates in another shape. Wagon wheels on shell-paved streets, a horse stamping, someone calling to someone down a lane. The prisoners did not answer any of it. The floor under the blankets was hard. The air was thick. A baby fussed and then went back under with the training that comes when sleep is stolen often and given back only in pieces. A woman sat with her back to the wall and her feet out straight, eyes on the doorway until the last guard passed and the sound of boots faded. The days that followed did not soften. They hardened into a schedule that made the condition permanent. At Fort Pickens, work details were made formal. Prisoners carried fuel and stores, scrubbed stone and cleared drainage after rain. They were kept inside the walls. Guards stood on the parapet and in the yard. A surgeon kept notes on fever and on old injuries that flared in damp. An officer wrote the same lines in the log every evening: number present, number sick, rations issued, conduct steady, no incidents. At Fort Marion, the same words found their way into a different hand on different paper. Women were issued cloth and thread and told where they could sit to mend. Children were counted at morning and at last light with the rest. The coquina walls held sound and held names. Mail moved. Names were written on lists for letters that would be read aloud to those who could not read, then folded back into envelopes and placed under a ledger with other papers that carried the new life of these people. Some packages came from army posts that had known these names in Arizona. Some came from missionaries who knew only the words prisoner and need. Nothing in a box changed the fact recorded by the counts that men slept behind one set of walls and their families behind another, hundreds of miles apart, each held fast inside a system that called them prisoners and planned the next day for them before the sun came up. The transfer out of Arizona had ended the last fight in the field. The transfer into Florida set an end of a different kind. It removed the people from every piece of ground that had once given cover, water, food, and a way to move. It tightened control by timetable, guard mount, ration issue, and report. It replaced the roll and pitch of a ride with the flat repetition of a day that looks like the day before. The men assigned to enforce it wrote their lines in books and cut orders from habit. The men and women assigned to endure it made places on floors and taught children where to sit, where to walk, where to drink from a dipper without spilling, where to hold their voices even when the air felt like a hand on the mouth. As October turned to November, the Gulf air cooled, the days shortened. The routine at Fort Pickens and at Fort Marion stayed fixed. A steamer brought supplies and carried off papers that kept the War Department informed to the line and to the digit. The people inside the forts kept their bodies and their families in the small spaces allotted to them. A guard with a pencil and a board checked them at hours that did not change. The exile that began on this day held fast. The war that had burned through mountain folds and desert flats ended here as counts, seals, and walls that reached down into the water and would not move.